Some memories never leave us. They come back at the most unexpected moments, laden with details that insist on remaining alive, even when we try to move on. This story is one of those. Good evening, Dom. I've always enjoyed listening to the stories you tell, and today I felt it was my turn to share one. My name is Ricardo, and what I'm about to share is a very personal experience. It happened to me a few years ago, and to this day I carry every detail of that memory. My grandfather Arnaldo, who is no longer with us, was always a man with a strong personality. He got used to solving everything on his own, and that's how he raised his family. Anyone who knew him was aware that despite his dry and somewhat brusque manner, he had a generous heart and was extremely devoted to the people he loved. He was a man of the mountain, someone whose life always revolved around the fields and cattle. Over time, he and my grandmother stayed on the ranch, while their children went their own ways. Some went to the United States, others sought a life in the city. Among them, my parents were the closest, living in a village about 5 hours away. Because of that, my mother, his daughter, used to visit them fairly often. To understand this story, we need to go back in time, a few months after my grandmother passed away. Her death was a huge blow to everyone, but for my grandfather Arnaldo, it was devastating. She was his life companion, his confidant, and unconditional support. I never saw him so torn as he was then. He would cry uncontrollably, scream, as if on the verge of going mad. Even today, recalling those days brings me a pain that's hard to describe. After she was gone, he completely shut himself off. He spent a few days with us, but his anguish only grew. He was restless to return to the ranch, insisting he couldn't leave it alone, that the animals needed him, that the crops wouldn't survive without his care. But what worried us most was something he started repeating often. He said my grandmother was waiting for him. Whenever we heard that, we felt a tightness in our chests. It was painful to see that strong man, who had always been our pillar, sinking into a reality that no longer existed. One evening at dinner, he refused to eat until my grandmother sat at the table. All I wanted then was to hold him, to show him he wasn't alone, that we were still there for him. During the nights, in the room next to mine, I heard him crying softly until the medication my mother gave him finally made him sleep. He stayed with us for only a week. After that, he flat out refused to remain any longer and went back to the ranch. My mother stayed with him for a few days, but her job as a teacher didn't allow her to be there too long. We tried to bring him back, to convince him to stay with us, but his stubbornness was unshakable. No argument would ever change his mind. My mother told us he was keeping his usual routine, getting up before dawn to milk the cows, cutting grass throughout the day, and bathing in the river at dusk. For her, seeing her own father in that condition was painful. She understood his sorrow because she too had lost her mother, but she knew she had to keep going. She had a family that depended on her. And that's what we tried to show my grandfather, that we needed him too, but to him none of that seemed to matter. When my mother came home, there was a clear worry on her face. They had hired someone to stay with my grandfather for a while, a young man who could help with the ranch tasks. However, my grandfather's difficult temperament made the work unsustainable. Within a few weeks, the young man gave up and left, saying it was impossible to deal with him, that he complained about everything, and that he could no longer stand the arguments. Besides helping on the farm, the young man also took care of the house and made meals, but the coexistence became so stressful that nothing could convince him to stay. I clearly remember the words he said. My grandfather spent his days talking to my grandmother, mentioning her as if she was still there, interacting with her as if he could see her. He tried to be understanding, knowing that losing a great love can shake anyone. But sometimes my grandfather's behavior was so unusual, it left him uneasy. He told all this to my mother, who, though respectful, couldn't hide her own discomfort. Nobody likes to hear such comments about someone they love. Days went by, and at that time, I was also going through a rough patch. At work, my relationship with my boss was becoming unbearable. The atmosphere was heavy and more tense every day. By the end of the month, I reached my limit and quit. Truth be told, I didn't mind that much. I was 25, I hadn't even been at that company for a year, and I still lived with my parents. I just didn't like the idea of spending my days idle at home. I started looking for jobs in several places, but the openings that appeared didn't offer good pay. One night, talking to my mother, she suggested something unexpected, that I spend some time at my grandfather's ranch. She said I could stay for 2 weeks and if I liked it, maybe extend it to a month. At first, I didn't know what to say. It seemed like an interesting idea to clear my head and ease some of the tension of the past few months. Besides, the ranch was isolated, without outside distractions, a real retreat. After thinking it through a few days later, I told my mother I would accept her suggestion. She was surprised. Perhaps she hadn't expected me to agree, but also relieved, knowing it would make her feel more at peace about my grandfather. I just made it clear that he would definitely go on complaining about the food. My mother insisted on taking me to the ranch. During the trip, memories flooded my mind. It had been years since I'd been there. Seeing the surrounding landscape, I felt a tightness in my chest. My grandmother's presence was sorely missed. As a child, she was the one who took care of me, picked up any book and told me stories about magical beings that lived in the forests. Only years later did my mother reveal that my grandmother had never actually learned to read. All those stories were her own creations, tales invented to make me happy. When we finally arrived, I saw the house in the distance, surrounded by fields, with the corral beside it. The trip was long and tiring, and I wasn't in the best mood myself. As soon as we approached, I saw my grandfather standing at the door. I didn't expect him to be waiting for us, but there he was, with a broad, welcoming smile. When he saw me, he walked over and pulled me into a tight hug. I noticed he was thinner, but I decided not to comment. Something about him seemed different. There was a sparkle in his eyes, a lighter energy, a less burdened aura. "Your grandmother will be very happy to see you," he said. I smiled, though somewhat confused. My mother had planned to spend at least 2 days with us, but at the last minute a colleague of hers got sick and she had to cover for them, so she had to head back the same day. I told her not to worry, that I'd be fine at the ranch and there was no reason for concern. Even so, before leaving, she went into the kitchen and prepared something for us to eat together. The house was exactly as I remembered. In a way, my grandfather kept everything in place, and the space remained clean and organized. During the meal, he talked about the watermelons he was harvesting. Actually, he kept talking the entire time. But what struck me most was the way he mentioned my grandmother. He didn't speak of her in the past tense, as someone who was gone, but in the present, as if she was still there, by his side. Before leaving, my mother reminded me that if I needed anything, I could call her. But to do that, I'd have to walk about half an hour to the top of a small hill, where the signal was a bit more reliable. As soon as she left, it was just my grandfather and me in the house. He seemed calm and happy with my presence, totally different from the last time we spoke. In the late afternoon, he went out for a while. I didn't ask where he was going, and he didn't volunteer any explanation. I used that moment to walk around the house. It was a simple home, but filled with memories. I still hadn't quite processed everything, but suddenly I was overcome by recollections of my grandmother. The aroma of the meals she used to cook seemed to fill the air. The sweetness of her voice echoed in my mind, and a suffocating sensation clutched my chest. In the living room, her photographs were still there. Near the entrance, her old sewing machine remained untouched. In the kitchen, the cloth she always used while cooking still hung in the same place. She was like a second mother to me, but at that moment I realized that in a way I'd left her behind. When did I stop thinking about her? When did I get used to her absence? Something caught in my throat, and before I could hold it back, tears started streaming down my face. Standing in the middle of the house, I cried uncontrollably, overwhelmed by the sadness of knowing I would never hug her again, that I wasn't there for her final moments. At dinner, my grandfather took over the kitchen. I was surprised. My grandmother always said he was a good cook, but I had never seen him prepare anything. To my surprise, the food was delicious, simple, but comforting. However, what really unsettled me was the way he talked. With a gleam in his eyes, he said my grandmother was excited to see me, that maybe she'd come by that night just to say hi. I smiled uncertainly, not knowing how to react. Deep down, I felt a pang in my chest, a silent sadness seeing him speak so happily as if she had never left. I stayed in the room that once belonged to my uncles. The bed was already made, everything in order, as though always waiting for someone. I admired my grandfather's dedication to keeping everything neat. But that first night, sleep didn't come easily. The house was old and the wooden floor creaked with every movement. In the middle of the night, a loud noise woke me. The cows in the corral were restless, mooing loudly as if something had startled them. I sat up in bed and listened intently. That's when I noticed a distant sound like footsteps in the dark. My first thought was that it could be my grandfather. I left the room and walked to the back door. The kitchen door was ajar. Looking at the table, I saw a plate set out, a piece of meat with vegetables on the side. I frowned. It seemed odd. Maybe my grandfather had forgotten to put the food away. I walked closer to the door and looked outside. A thin fog covered the field, forming a light veil over the corral. In the dark, I could only make out the silhouettes of the cattle moving slowly. I stood there for a few seconds, feeling the cold night air. There was no one else around. I closed the door and went back to my room. The animals stayed uneasy for quite a while, but somehow I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I took the chance to walk around. I went over to the corral and observed the cows. In one corner, I saw my grandfather's horse, the same one I remembered so well. A bit further on to the right, I noticed a small greenhouse. My grandmother had always been passionate about plants and spent hours tending her garden. But something was wrong. It looked abandoned. I went closer and realized all the plants around it were dried up, like something was killing the soil. Maybe a plague was attacking the ranch. The greenhouse door was locked. At that moment, a thought crossed my mind. My grandmother would hate to see her garden like that. If no one else was doing anything, maybe it was up to me to bring it back to life. When my grandfather returned, I asked him for the greenhouse key and explained my plan. He just smiled and said my grandmother would be delighted to see her garden bloom again. That very afternoon, I entered the greenhouse. What I found was even more desolate than I'd imagined. The plants were wilted, the ground covered in dead leaves, and the gardening tools were scattered around, as if someone had left them there and never came back. I started clearing out everything that was lifeless. My grandfather suggested I go to the town to get new seedlings. Days went by. The first week at the ranch passed. I began helping with the daily tasks, milking, feeding the animals, and also caring for the greenhouse. The new plants arrived, and little by little the place started getting some color again. But there was still something bothering me, my grandfather's behavior. Often I heard him mumbling to himself, sometimes so softly it was nearly inaudible. Other times he laughed out loud as if he were really talking to someone. But he was always alone. What disturbed me most was the impression that he was answering somebody. He would pause, listen, then speak again, as if he had company. One time he told me my grandmother wanted to see me, but that she still didn't feel ready to come closer. The hair on my arms stood on end. The way he said it, it sounded real. One night while I was reading, a noise in the living room made me look up. A mechanical, rhythmic sound. For some reason it seemed familiar. I put the book aside and stepped toward the bedroom door. The sound was coming from the living room, but as soon as I reached the doorway, everything went silent. I peeked through the crack in the door, and that's when I saw it. My grandmother's sewing machine, the old pedal-operated one. I swallowed hard. There was nobody there, but I knew what I had heard. I walked closer, cautiously, and tapped the pedal with my foot. The machine resumed its function, reproducing exactly the same sound. My heart sped up. I won't deny I was terrified. Just then my grandfather's words came back to me. He always spoke of my grandmother as if she had never left. A chill ran through my arms. Without thinking, I got up and headed to the bedroom. Before going in, I heard a sudden thump. The kitchen door was open, banging in the wind. I called out to my grandfather, assuming he might be outside, but there was no answer. I looked around the ranch, and off in the distance I could only see the horse in my field of vision. "What's going on?" His voice sounded behind me, making me jump. He wanted to know if I'd called him. I nodded. Without saying much, he walked over to the door and shut it. I asked if he wouldn't lock it, or at least put something in the way so it wouldn't open on its own. But he just looked at me seriously and answered, "Number, if you do that, your grandmother won't be able to come in." I had no words and left. But before I closed my bedroom door, I asked if he'd heard the sewing machine before. He casually denied it. He only said that if I'd heard something, it was probably my grandmother. A strange tightness rose in my throat and a tingling spread through my hands. He spoke with such certainty that, for a moment, I wondered if he might be serious, but it made no sense. I closed the door and lay down, staring at the ceiling. My grandfather might be delirious. Maybe he was sleepwalking. Everything that had happened in the last few months must have affected his mind. But no matter what he said, my grandmother was dead. On the ranch, I kept working on the greenhouse. The day had already ended and I was focused on arranging the hanging plants. I got so wrapped up in the task I lost track of time. The door was closed when I heard some knocking. I assumed it was my grandfather and went to open it, but there was no one there. I thought I'd made a mistake and left the door ajar. A bit later I heard a crack. The door had shut on its own. My first guess was the wind, but moments later, more knocks sounded, now louder. I went to the entrance and opened it again. I only found darkness outside. I stepped out to see if my grandfather was playing a trick on me. Shortly after, he appeared at the door of the house, apologizing. He said he hadn't heard anything because he was making dinner. I told him I just wanted to show him how the greenhouse was coming along. He joined me, and when he saw the progress, he praised my work. While hugging me, he mumbled, "Your grandmother will be very pleased when she sees this." Over the following days, it all started to affect me. I couldn't sleep well. During the nights, I stayed alert, trying to interpret every noise around me. Sometimes I thought I heard something among the animals, as if someone was disturbing them. But what really unsettled me was a woman's laughter in the middle of the night. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find a reasonable explanation for it. Over breakfast, I decided to mention the noises that were keeping me awake. I hoped he'd give me a rational explanation, but what he said only increased my unease. Without hesitation, he said it was my grandmother. He explained with the same certainty as always that she loved playing with the animals during the night. After all, taking care of the ranch had always been her job. A heavy discomfort pressed on my shoulders. The idea of seeing that man still clinging to the memory of his wife, as if her death had never happened, was starting to eat away at me. Maybe that was fueling my own delusions, but deep down I was avoiding the facts. I didn't want to hurt him, and that was never my intention. At the same time, I couldn't find a logical explanation for everything happening. The knocking on the door, the sewing machine noise, the restless cattle in the night. It all seemed woven into a strange and growing cycle, weighing on my mind with a silent fear. From that moment on, the ranch was no longer a home and began to suffocate me. 2 weeks had passed since I'd arrived, and the feeling only got worse. Something else caught my attention. The plants in the greenhouse, the ones my grandfather had brought so carefully, were dying. He still tried to keep them alive, but it was as if they were doomed. Their leaves drooped, the stems dried out, the life in them seemed to slowly slip away. I spent most of my afternoons there among the plants. Somehow that space gave me a sense of refuge, a place where everything felt more stable. One late afternoon, my grandfather said he was going out to gather firewood. I offered to go with him, but he refused, saying I should stay to tend the animals. He promised he wouldn't be long. By the time I finally left the greenhouse, night had already fallen. I was covered in dirt and exhausted. As I approached the back entrance to the house, I noticed all the lights were off. I went in through the kitchen, called out for my grandfather, expecting to find him there, but got no answer. I stayed at the door for a moment, calling him again. Silence. Maybe he hadn't returned yet, or he was already asleep. I switched on the kitchen light and poured myself a glass of water. From there, I could see the hallway leading to the small living room where the bedrooms were. The first was mine, then his. As I looked for something to eat, a movement at the corner of my eye made my body freeze. I looked up. In the dim hallway, I saw a silhouette leaning subtly out of my grandfather's bedroom door. The low light made it hard to see, but it looked like someone was watching me, completely still. I assumed it was him and asked if he'd already finished collecting firewood. No answer. The figure stayed there, unmoving, the face turned toward me. A sense of unease spread through my chest. I offered to fix dinner, trying to break the suffocating silence. Again, nothing. Then, without warning, the figure collapsed to the floor. The sound of the body hitting was abrupt, brutal. My instincts made me rush over to the fallen figure. My first thought was that my grandfather had fainted. But as I got closer, I sensed something was off. That was not the silhouette of a man. My eyes registered the detail of long hair spilled on the floor. My heart pounded. I felt a cold sweat at the back of my neck. My body hesitated, but I forced myself to move closer. Even in the shadows, I could see the pale tone of the skin, almost translucent. With trembling hands, I turned on the light. The dark strands covered the fallen figure's face. Its head was tilted strangely to one side, bent further than the human body should allow. My stomach churned. Then a sound, a soft moan rising from the floor. The body shook slightly. My voice came out strained as I called my grandfather, hoping he'd appear and get me out of there. But he didn't respond. I swallowed hard and hesitantly crouched beside the collapsed form. My fingers touched an arm. It was cold, an unnatural chill, as if there was no blood flowing, like paper. And then, in a faint whisper that the silence of the house nearly swallowed, I heard a name repeated. Marlene, Marlene, Marlene. The body began convulsing violently as though seized by spasms. I backed away, my hands shaking, feeling a chill run through my skin. The moaning grew stronger, echoing through the room. I wanted to run, but my body refused to move. Then I saw that thing getting up. But it wasn't a normal motion. It seemed like its bones weren't following any logic, and the way the body rose was wrong, tilted in a way no human body could manage. Marlene, the voice echoed again, drawn out and deep. It was close, too close. The gaunt, fragile silhouette trembled in the dim light, its waist leaning sideways as if it couldn't bear its own weight. The face was still hidden beneath the curtain of dark hair. I couldn't move. When its steps began coming toward me, terror gripped me completely. My heart pounded, and the air felt dense. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I nearly tripped, but I braced myself against the wall. What was that? How did it know my grandmother's name? I heard that dark moan again, but this time it was near, very near. I felt a dreadful weight on my shoulders, as if something invisible was stuck to me. I flailed my arms, my hands slapping at my back, trying to get it off, but there was nothing there. The weight didn't go away. Panic took over. I reached the kitchen and shouted for my grandfather. I screamed until my throat burned, calling out as I ran outside. In my desperation, I tore off my shirt, trying to free myself from that suffocating feeling. I ran to the corral with no idea what else to do. Then, in an instant, the weight vanished. My lungs felt like I'd just surfaced from drowning. The terror still throbbed inside me. I looked around. The animals were restless, moving about nervously as if they too sensed that presence. I turned toward the house and stared at the kitchen door. A chill crept up my spine. Something was wrong. Everything felt distorted, out of place. I circled the yard, filled with a maddening confusion, wanting to scream or cry. My eyes kept flicking back to the house, fearing I might see that thing again. My grandfather's words came flooding back. He spoke of my grandmother as if she were still there. Could he have been talking about that creature? It couldn't be. I wouldn't accept it. Then at last I saw a figure emerge from the house. I froze, but soon recognized my grandfather. I ran up to him, trembling all over. My voice shook as I tried to explain what I'd seen. There was someone in the house. He looked at me, surprised, maybe expecting me to say something more coherent. But what could I say? How could I put into words what had happened? My grandfather went inside without hesitation and checked every room. I stayed in the doorway, refusing to set foot back in there. When he returned, he assured me there was nothing. The house was empty. That night, I begged him to stay in my room with me. Fear still had me in its grip. Lying there, I kept my eyes open, alert to every noise, every shadow, every minor change in the air. I wanted to believe my mind had played a trick on me, but I couldn't. I had touched that thing. It was real, and all I wanted now was to leave that place. As soon as my grandfather got up, I followed him to the corral for milking. I didn't want to be alone, not for a second. He kept glancing at me with concern, the worry plain on his face. I guess my frightened expression didn't help. At daybreak, when we returned to the house, I sank into one of the armchairs. The exhaustion of a sleepless night weighed on me. I dozed off for a good while. When I woke, I realized my grandfather was just finishing up the meal. He called me to the table. I wasn't hungry and still felt disoriented, but he insisted I at least taste something. Your grandmother didn't like what happened last night. She tried to come closer, but you ran away." His words sent a cold shiver from my feet to my neck. My voice came out weak, hesitant. "I don't understand." His serious gaze showed he wasn't joking. Before he could continue, I felt a suffocating wave. This simply made no sense. My heart pounded. I shouted, "Grandpa, my grandmother is dead. She couldn't have been here last night. She died." He kept a steady face. The silence between us was thick. Then calmly he said, "That's not true. She comes by every day." He didn't add anything else and went back to eating as if that conversation were nothing out of the ordinary. My legs were shaking when I got up. Each step was a struggle. I went outside, hoping the fresh air would help somehow, but in just a moment everything crumbled. I broke down crying, overwhelmed by confusion and dread. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to leave that place. By nightfall, I mustered the courage to ask if we could talk. In the living room, I was direct. I wanted to go away. I didn't feel right there. He just looked at me, silent, almost unsettling. "If you want, I can take you to the city." I had too many questions, all laced with fear. What was going on? He merely shrugged. He said the choice was mine, and that he didn't understand why I wanted to leave. That only confused me more. He acted like nothing was out of place. I tried, speaking tensely, to explain that what I saw was not my grandmother. Whatever it wasn't human. But he stayed firm, repeating the same thing, as if his conviction were unshakable. And that terrified me. How could he accept that presence so calmly? How had that thing crossed the ranch's threshold without him finding it strange? To him, it was simply his wife. His lack of emotion began to irritate me. I couldn't pretend everything was fine, but I also couldn't bear the idea of leaving him alone with that. I suggested we move in with my mother. There, he'd have comfort and care. But his answer came back filled with anger. He wasn't going anywhere. He wouldn't leave the ranch. He was fine there, content. His stubbornness exasperated me even more, and then firmly I blurted it out once and for all. "Grandpa, my grandmother is dead. She's not coming back. Whatever you're seeing isn't her." For an instant I noticed a change in his eyes. They glistened, filling with tears, as if something deep and final had broken inside him. I hadn't meant to hurt him, but I had to say it. Soon, tears were rolling down his face, and he broke down, something I hadn't witnessed since my grandmother's funeral. He tried to wipe his face, but the sobbing was uncontrollable. "You have no idea, my son, what it's like to spend a whole life with someone and suddenly be alone. I miss her every day. I feel like I didn't value her as I should have, and now that she's gone, the pain is unbearable. Knowing I'll never be able to hold her again, tell her I love her, that I need her. It destroys me." He paused, but the tremor in his voice said he wasn't done. "She was there with me when our children left. She stayed. It was hard watching her get sick, feeling her body weaken day by day. I cared for her until her last breath. Every morning I woke her up, helped her bathe, made her coffee. We talked about everything, our youth, the times we conspired together, the places we discovered, the family we built. And suddenly she was gone. She never opened her eyes again. Even knowing this day would come, nothing prepared me for this pain." He took a deep breath, then said something that chilled me. "I hope you understand this pain one day, son. I miss my little old lady more than I can bear." Those words cut through my soul. He wept like never before, and I felt a weight crushing my chest. My own tears flowed before I could hold them back. There was nothing to say. A knot closed my throat. All I could do was hold him, letting him cry against my chest. After some time, he tried to explain, but it all sounded disjointed, illogical. There were many gaps. He said that when he returned to the ranch after the funeral, he thought about giving everything up. To him, life had lost its meaning. Each night he lay down hoping to find her again, and each morning he woke with her memory as his first thought. The house fell into neglect. The days lost their rhythm. Until she appeared. That was when everything got even more confusing. He spoke of that presence as if it were my grandmother, describing her voice, her face, the way she smiled. For him, there was no difference. It was her. He didn't get what I'd seen. He couldn't grasp my reaction. To him, nothing was wrong. My grandfather's conviction scared me. He said she knew things only the two of them shared, memories only they could have. Her gestures, her looks, her laughter, it was all the same. But what I saw wasn't alive. It was a grotesque imitation, a shadow of what my grandmother had been. I asked where it had come from, how it got there. He evaded the question, changed the subject, gave answers that made no sense. I insisted. I had to convince him to leave with me, to let us help, to open his eyes. But then I realized something terrible. Part of me wanted to believe my grandmother was still around, because the alternative was too frightening. My grandfather looked at me, tears in his eyes once more. I no longer knew if we were just confused, or if we were truly losing our minds. Despite the lingering fear, I decided to stay for a few more weeks after that conversation. The only condition I set was that whatever that thing was, it shouldn't come near me. I didn't want to know anything more. On his face, I saw a trace of sadness and dejection, but he didn't argue. He just nodded, accepting my choice. The truth is, my heart broke seeing him so vulnerable. He wanted in some way to make up for the lost time between us, and I couldn't just walk away. He kept talking about my grandmother as if she was still there. At night, he set a plate for her at the table, and some nights I heard the muffled sound of the sewing machine at work. I started sleeping with headphones on. Maybe it sounds excessive, but that was the only way I could ignore what was going on in that house. In the end, it wasn't my place to take his happiness away. If it made him smile, if it kept him going, who was I to interfere? If he no longer wanted to discuss it, I respected that. Years went by, but the doubt stayed with me. What really happened there? What did my grandfather do to make that possible? A pact? Something beyond our understanding? I still don't know. After he passed, my mother and I went back to the ranch to put the house in order. I searched every corner, looking for any trace, any clue, some explanation for what he refused to tell me. But there was nothing out of place, no answers, everything looked normal. For my mother, the loss was devastating. I thought about telling her what had happened, but what would be the point? I had no proof, no answers, only murky memories that would never make sense. Bringing it up again would only cause more pain. Sometimes in the stillness of night I cry without realizing it. I try to let go of the memory, but my mind keeps returning to his words, to the unwavering love he felt for my grandmother, to how much he missed her. He only wanted to see her happy. He just wanted to make his final years with her good, so she could enjoy the house, life, time. And me, I don't know if I did the right thing by letting it happen and staying silent. Maybe he paid a price I'll never understand. I only hope with all my heart that my grandmother is finally at peace. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get the latest stories. Your presence means a lot, and your support is essential. All right, let's keep going. Good evening, Dom. My name is Yasmin. My entire family settled in the heart of Durango, a state in northern Mexico known for its vast rural areas and mountain ranges. A long time ago, everyone decided to sell their land in the outskirts, in a place called Nombre de Dios. Everyone except my great-uncle Gailan, yes, that's his name, who still remains there to this day. He always said that city life never suited him. He liked the town where he grew up, in the region near that community I mentioned. That's why he never gave up his house, even though he frequently visits the city. However, at the end of the day, he always returns to his ranch without hesitation. A few years ago, he shared a story with me that left me shocked, something I had never imagined possible. If I had heard it from a stranger, or even from someone who tends to joke about such things, I probably would have doubted it. But since my Uncle Gailan was the one telling it, my reaction was immediate. Uncle, I believe you without a doubt. I know it may be hard to accept something like this, so I don't blame anyone who finds it difficult to believe this really happened. He told me that he experienced this right after the rest of the family moved to the city. Since he had grown up in that place, it was common for him to stay there alone at night, in complete darkness, as back then there were no street lights in that part of the region. Some services reached the area, but electricity was not one of them. It was during this time that he began to notice something different. According to him, it all happened for the first time in 1970. One night, he was in the yard, about to go inside, collecting clothes from the line. He was still single at the time and lived completely isolated from any neighbors. As he did this, a bright flash caught his attention. He quickly turned toward the hill, trying to understand what was lighting up his house. When he looked up at the sky, he saw something gigantic slowly crossing overhead, leaving behind a strange reddish glow. It was like a trail, coming from the tip of the object, a shape he never managed to identify. Since then, he said he had never encountered anything even remotely similar to what he saw that night. Not airplanes, nor any type of known aircraft. Nothing. According to him, the thing had an appearance that in some way reminded him of a jellyfish, though it wasn't exactly that. The impact of that sighting was so great that he could barely sleep that night. The fear mixed with a strange excitement kept him awake, hoping it would pass by again. The light had been so intense that if it happened again, he would see it through the window. And for weeks, he waited. But nothing. About a month and a half later, everything repeated itself. He was in the kitchen when he noticed something lighting up the yard again. He dropped everything in his hands and ran outside. There it was again. He couldn't tell if it was a machine, a living being, or something else, but it was undeniably there, hovering high in the sky, easily visible. That year he said he saw the same thing about 7 times. Even after so many appearances, his reaction never changed. Every time that glow appeared, he would run outside to see it. And to this day, he has never found an explanation for what he witnessed. My uncle told me that in the last times he saw it, he noticed that the trail changed colors on some occasions, sometimes red, sometimes green, with subtle traces of yellow, although red was always predominant. The most impressive part was the size of the trail, extremely wide, and the way it disappeared, as if the object simply ascended vertically and vanished into the sky. The following year, everything happened exactly the same way. He continued to see that thing from time to time, but no matter how much he asked the villagers, no one seemed to have witnessed the same thing. Only one neighbor once commented that he noticed the yard lighting up in a strange way one night, but out of fear or disinterest, he didn't go outside to check. Other than that, no one else mentioned anything similar. And even that neighbor had only seen the light, never what caused it. After 2 years of observing this phenomenon, though sporadically, my uncle began to notice a change. The object was passing by more and more slowly. It maintained the same height, as far as he could estimate visually, and its appearance didn't change, but its movement was becoming slower. Additionally, it no longer flickered like before. Eventually, over time, it disappeared completely. For about 10 months, maybe a year, he doesn't remember exactly, there was no sign of it. Until one random night, while cleaning the yard and tidying up some things late at night, he happened to look up, and there it was again. But this time, something was different. The intense glow that used to illuminate the patio was gone. The light had faded, and what remained was just a washed-out shape, barely perceptible. During that final sighting, the object maintained the same slow pace as before, the same size and the same altitude, but it seemed to be dissolving. It no longer changed colors. The red that once dominated was barely distinguishable. Then, without any warning, it disappeared completely. It was never seen again. That was when my uncle started to question things. He knew it might sound absurd, but in his own words, he believed that what he saw that last time was like the soul, the ghost, or the final remnant of what he had been observing for years. What if that thing was alive, and if at that moment it was dying before his eyes? He compared it to what people say about human spirits, that they sometimes manifest as translucent shadows until they finally vanish. Maybe that thing also had some kind of existence beyond the physical, something that dissipated into the air like a lingering trace of what it once was. When he told me this, I didn't know how to react. It was such an outlandish idea. But what else could I do? I started looking into records of secret projects, aircraft prototypes from that era, anything that could explain that shape. But I found nothing resembling what he described. And then I started wondering, what if what exists out there beyond our world isn't so different from us? Does everything that is alive have a soul? or does it not? And if it doesn't, what remains when it dies? Could some part of its energy continue to manifest like a ghost? I know that stories like this always challenge our understanding. These kinds of accounts take us to places where logic fails, where questions multiply without answers. But maybe that's precisely why they belong to the unknown. Today I want to tell you about the strangest moment I have ever experienced. At the time it was terrifying, but it also changed everything. Maybe my life would have taken a different path if it hadn't happened. It was 2001 and I was expecting our first daughter. My husband worked away from home while I was on maternity leave. One ordinary morning I got up to go to the kitchen. Our house was small and the kitchen had those saloon-style doors that swing on their own and only cover the upper part of the body. As I walked through the hallway, I was struck by an indescribable shock. My husband walked out of the kitchen, passing through those doors. But that made no sense at all. He had been at work for at least 2 hours already. The shock made me react with irritation, scolding him for scaring me like that. However, his response was even more unsettling. Staring fixedly at my belly, without even meeting my eyes, he spoke in a grave tone. "We need to go to the doctor. The baby is getting sick." Saying this, he began walking backward, returning to the kitchen without turning his face away. The doors swung and closed behind him. Instinctively, I lowered my gaze, trying to see his feet. Any sign that he was still there, but there was nothing. Overcome by confusion and anger at what seemed like a cruel joke, I rushed to the kitchen. It was completely empty. Before I could even process what had just happened, the phone rang. The phone was right there in the kitchen. I picked up, my heart still racing, and heard my real husband's voice on the other end of the line. "Babe, tell me you're okay. I took a quick nap at work, just 5 minutes, and woke up terrified. I dreamed that something really bad was happening to you and the baby." My husband never talked to me about his dreams, and he never called from work without a real reason. But the worst part was that his nightmare had happened at the exact same time I had seen that apparition. I told him what had just occurred, and without hesitation he insisted that I go to the doctor, assuring me he would meet me at the clinic as soon as he could get leave from work. Despite the fright, I wasn't feeling any concerning symptoms. I told him to save his leave for a real emergency, as I would go by myself and let him know if anything was wrong. He agreed, though reluctantly. At the doctor's office, he examined me and identified an infection that could have seriously complicated the pregnancy at that stage. Fortunately, we had caught it just in time to treat the problem. We were able to prevent something much worse. When I told my husband about the diagnosis, we felt immense relief, but we spent days trying to understand what had really happened that morning. Who did I see? It was identical to him. Why did it warn me that way and then simply vanish? How did it coincide at the exact moment with my husband's dream? Stories about doppelganger apparitions, a phenomenon where someone sees an identical copy of themselves or someone still alive, often associated with omens or unknown dimensions, are usually different from this. This felt like something else, but what? What made that warning possible just in time? If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to leave a like. It really makes a difference. Okay, let's continue. Among the gnarled foliage of a tree, a figure leaned subtly. From a distance, it looked human, or almost so. The image of that creature stuck in my mind, a deformed silhouette lurking among the shadows. I thought it would end there, a momentary fright, but when it climbed down from the tree and started approaching, my body froze. A low, cutting laugh escaped its lips as it advanced. Then, instinctively, I ran. Behind me, a shrill scream tore through the silence. In the next instant, the thing was in front of me, blocking my way. I tried to speak, to say I was already leaving, that I didn't want any trouble, but the being just stared at me with frantic eyes. I was about to try another route, but it was faster. It threw itself on me, digging its elongated hands into my shoulders before hurling me against a tree. Its face came so close that I could feel its irregular breathing. Within seconds, I began to be crushed against the trunk. The creature laughed insanely, its mouth impossibly wide, with no teeth to be seen. My father was a highly respected mason in our village. He gained recognition little by little, starting with small home repairs, then making gravestones in the cemetery, until they began calling him for bigger jobs. He was always meticulous, attentive to every detail of his work. When I was a child, I liked to follow him at work, and that's how I learned the trade. In my teens, I was already his right-hand man. When he died, I took over everything. My main activity was building houses. I started within our own village, but over time, requests came from neighboring communities. I preferred working alone, but for larger projects I had to hire 3 helpers. I led a simple, independent life. By the time I was 30, I was married and had 2 children. With great effort, I built my house, laying the foundation for my family. Up to that point, I had been involved in medium-scale projects, but nothing compared to what was about to appear. Late in the afternoon, a high-end pickup truck parked in front of my house. In our town, we knew exactly who owned such vehicles. My wife entered the bedroom uneasy, warning me that someone wanted to talk to me. It was a message from a man of the mania, as we called the organized crime that dominated the region. The guy had a radio attached to his waist, wore a bulletproof vest and a cap. Without beating around the bush, he explained that his boss wanted me to build his house. He had heard about my work and decided I would be the one responsible for the construction. The man spoke calmly and made it clear that the project would take place up in the mountains, in a village several hours away. He said he needed my answer as soon as possible. We were sitting at the dining room table and I didn't know what to say. I asked for time to think, and he gave me a contact number. That night I spoke with my wife. Fear was inevitable. I didn't want to accept, but I already knew too many stories about people like that. My biggest concern was protecting my family. I had already done small jobs for people from the Manya, but never anything as big as an entire house. Besides, I had no idea what that boss really wanted or how far it might go. It took me a while to gather the courage to make the call. In the end, I didn't call. But 2 days later, another luxury pickup truck stopped in front of my house. This time, 3 men got out of the vehicle. They were well armed and intimidated us without much effort. Even so, when we sat at the table, they were polite and direct. They made it very clear how much the boss was willing to pay. It was a lot of money, more than I ever imagined. They noticed my surprise and quickly added that I could ask for as much as I wanted. For them, money was no obstacle. I remained silent. I didn't know what to say in the face of such a proposal. "And if, for some reason, I can't do it?" I asked, trying to hide the tension in my voice. "We're sure you're smart enough not to refuse," one of them said without hesitation. The threat was obvious. That night was long. I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with possibilities, and none of them looked good. I spoke with my wife and my mother, but there wasn't much time to think. 2 days after that visit, I made my decision. I accepted. I felt like I was being watched all the time, as if there were eyes on me, analyzing my every step. I didn't want to risk my family's safety. I called my 3 trusted men and explained the situation. To my surprise, none of them hesitated. The money spoke louder. They needed it. Thus, less than a week later, the 4 of us were inside a luxury pickup truck on our way to the territory of the patron, the boss of the criminal organization for whom we would now work. From the moment I left home, the fear wouldn't let me go. Before leaving, I told my wife what steps to follow if she stopped hearing from me. I left some money hidden in case things got complicated. I hugged my children tight, held back the tears as best I could, and finally said goodbye with my heart in knots. The trip lasted about 7 hours to a small town I only knew by name. When we arrived, they transferred us to another vehicle and blindfolded us. It was then that I wondered for the first time if I had made the right choice. The men tried to reassure us, but who could relax inside the Manya's truck, blindfolded, with no idea where we were headed? During the ride, the road seemed full of bumps and stones. I prayed non-stop. Time passed in a strange way until finally the car stopped. They told us to remove the blindfolds. We were in the middle of nowhere. In every direction, only mountains and trees. The landscape was breathtaking, but fear kept me from appreciating it. All the construction materials were already there. I had no idea how they had managed to transport so much stuff to that isolated spot. Right next door was an old house where we would be staying. At least it had electricity. The men explained how everything would work. We had no vehicle available. From time to time, they would come to bring us food and supplies for the work. We also couldn't keep our cell phones. Instead, they gave us radios to maintain contact. That was when a scary thought crossed my mind. If they wanted to, they could erase us from the map without leaving a trace. I looked at my companions. Their silence told me they were thinking the exact same thing. When we were finally alone, I breathed a sigh of relief. The environment was extremely quiet, so much so that we could hear in the distance the gentle sound of water running in the river. Around us were what seemed to be old cultivation fields, now claimed by time. Without mentioning our predicament, we went straight to work. While two of my helpers checked the materials, the other one and I started cleaning the house that would serve as our shelter. The place didn't look inhabited for years, maybe decades. The structure was almost all wooden, with a cement floor and an aging tile roof. Even so, it was surprisingly solid. Inside, we found 2 bedrooms, plus a living room and a kitchen where we stored the supplies they'd left for us. Thankfully, food wouldn't be a problem. They had given us everything we needed, including a small refrigerator to store meat and other groceries. What we didn't find were beds. Instead, they had left hammocks, 2 to set up inside the house and 2 more for outside. They were enough. Each of us had only brought a small suitcase with some clothes and personal items, but nothing that required electricity. That first night, a bit calmer, we talked. The discomfort was obvious, but we tried to convince ourselves that as soon as the house was finished, we could return to our families. One thing that helped us cope was the handsome advance payment we'd received, not the total amount, but enough to be considered an impressive sum. Even so, sleeping was not easy. I spent a good part of the night thinking about my wife and children, but deep inside, there was a certainty. In a few months, it would all be over, and I would be back. The next morning, I woke up early and went to check the building materials. That's when I noticed something strange. The sand was all dug up, as if someone had been playing in it. There were footprints scattered around, too small to belong to any of us. I thought maybe one of the guys had done it for some reason, so I asked Anderson, one of the workers. He denied it. The others said they hadn't touched it either. It was odd. But we had a lot of work to do, so we didn't pay much attention. We figured maybe an animal had wandered in during the night. In the first few days, we focused on the house's foundation. The boss had already given me the plans, so I explained everything to the team, and we got to work. We quickly fell into a routine. That helped keep our minds busy, so we wouldn't dwell too much on our situation. At the end of the day, we went to the river to bathe. The water was crystal clear, and spending time there helped ease our worries. We usually went together, but sometimes someone ended up going alone. One evening during dinner, Saulo, one of the guys, mentioned seeing something unusual. According to him, there was a woman on the other side of the river. She seemed to be washing her feet in the water. He was sure it was a woman because of the clothing and the long hair draping her shoulders, but he couldn't see her face clearly, as the opposite bank was far and the light was already dim. Fabio, another worker, laughed and said it must have been Saulo's imagination. After all, there was supposedly no one else around. It would be impossible. A strange thing began happening to our food. It spoiled very quickly, even inside the fridge. The fruit barely lasted, and the meat would go bad sooner than expected. In less than 2 days, it was no longer fit to eat. We quickly learned that we had to consume it first before it became inedible. During dinner, we tried to distract ourselves by talking about who the real owner of that place might be. My helpers thought I knew the boss, but I admitted that I had never seen his face. It was his men who came to my house with the proposal. That was still a huge mystery to me. The work progressed and weeks passed. On one random night, Anderson and I were lying in the hammocks outside, talking about what we would do with the money we'd earn. He was excited. His girlfriend was pregnant and he wanted to use the payment to secure a better future for his family. I was about to share my own plans when he cut me off. Quiet for a second, and I stopped talking, confused. "What is it?" I asked. He just motioned for me to remain silent again. Then I listened. It was at that moment I heard it. A distant sound, carried by the wind. A baby crying, and it was low but clear. It came from the trees behind the house. Anderson stood up and began walking in that direction. I followed. The crying got louder. There was no doubt it was an infant's cry, but there was something off about it. It was cold. It seemed laden with a dark weight. How could there be a baby crying in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night? I decided to go inside and wake the others. Anderson followed me. "We heard a baby crying outside," I explained. The two workers looked at us as if we were crazy. Even so, they went out to check. But now, everything was silent. There was no sound, no crying, just the quiet night. They laughed. "You must have imagined it." Maybe, but Anderson and I knew what we heard. We went back to the hammocks, but that night the silence felt heavier than ever. Our group was split between those who slept inside the house and those who stayed outside. Anderson and I always slept in the hammocks outside. On another night, I woke up to an irritated voice. "Would you stop that?" I opened my eyes, still groggy. It was one of the workers who slept inside the house. He seemed annoyed. "What are you talking about? You know, knocking on the door non-stop. Enough already." Anderson and I exchanged looks. "We haven't done anything." The man huffed, clearly out of patience. He explained that he heard continuous knocks at the door. At first he thought it was part of a dream, but the knocking persisted and persisted, until his partner woke up too, equally annoyed. Fed up, one of them decided to open the door. There was nobody outside, and convinced we were playing a prank, they came to confront us. But the truth was that none of us had gone near the house that night. It wasn't us. Silence fell. Then what was it? The only explanation we had was that maybe some animal had been around. But no one seemed completely convinced. No one wanted to discuss it further that night. Weeks went by and the construction continued. From time to time, the boss's men showed up with more material and supplies. Until then, we hadn't mentioned the strange things we'd seen or heard. It seemed safer to keep quiet. We had no idea how they'd react if they found out there were presences around. Maybe they believed we were completely isolated, but the baby's crying and the woman in the river suggested otherwise. Better not to risk it. The longing for my family was a constant burden. All I had were a few photos kept in my wallet and a rosary I always carried in my shirt pocket. Before sleeping, I clutched it to my chest. My wife always told me to pray and trust God to guide me. That was undoubtedly one of the hardest parts of all this, being away from the people I love. But I wasn't the only one feeling that way. We all just wanted to finish and go home. The plan was to set up the house's basic structure. Then someone else would take over to finalize the work. To make things easier, we used a pump that drew water from the river through a long hose that crossed an old cornfield. Most of the time it worked fine, but when it failed, someone had to go check it. One afternoon it was my turn. I crossed the dry cornfield to the pump and began troubleshooting. A few minutes later, it was back up and running. The sun was already low and daylight was fading fast. I headed back through the cornfield. I hadn't walked far when I heard a noise behind me and I stopped. I thought it might be one of my helpers, but it seemed odd. That side of the river wasn't where we usually bathed. The sound persisted. What unsettled me was that it indicated something large moving among the plants, much bigger than a person. I ignored it and kept going, but suddenly a sound cut through the air, the neigh of a horse. It came from the direction of the river. Seconds later, another neigh, this time closer. Twilight was nearly gone. I hurried through the dry cornstalks when, just a few meters ahead, I saw a black horse standing there. But what drew my attention was the man riding it. I froze. The animal was huge, and the fading light made its coat even darker. The man wore black, a wide hat covering his head, and his face remained hidden in the shadows. I decided not to approach. "Good evening," I muttered. No response. He didn't move, but he was clearly facing me. A chill ran down my spine. There was something strange about his presence, unsettling. He didn't seem like just a man on a horse, but more like a shadow, unmoving atop the animal, looking at me without a face. "Do you have any idea whom you're serving?" he asked, his voice measured, calm. I was caught off guard. I didn't know what to say. "The man you work for is no good. He destroys innocent lives." His tone grew heavier, almost threatening. A knot formed in my throat. An odd heaviness settled in my chest. "You shouldn't get mixed up with people like that. You and your men are good. You should leave while you still can." I couldn't tell if it was a warning or a veiled threat. Until that moment, I had no idea who he was or how he could speak so confidently about us without having met us. "I've never seen the owner of this land in person," I muttered, trying to hide my fear. It was the absolute truth. But it was clear the man on the horse wouldn't be fooled. That man has caused enough suffering. There are those who want to see him fall, who wish for his downfall. Think about your family. My legs shook. How did he know I had children? The night's darkness seemed to arrive all at once. I could only make out the shape of the enormous horse and its rider. For the first time, I felt a fear that chilled me from within. This will never end. This land is doomed, and the one you work for is already marked. Without another word, he pulled the reins and vanished among the corn plants. I stood there paralyzed, trying to understand what had just happened. My heart pounded, and my legs trembled with every step through the field. When I got back to the house, Anderson was the first to look at me. "What happened? You're pale as a ghost." I didn't know if I should tell them. The fear of scaring them even more kept my lips sealed. That night, for the first time in a long while, I slept inside the house. But the stranger's words wouldn't leave me alone. They echoed inside me along with the one question I couldn't silence. How did he know about my family? A few days later, Saulo called me early to check the cement base we'd prepared the day before. That's when I noticed. There were footprints there. But they weren't normal footprints. They were small, like a child's. Saulo saw them too. Neither of us said anything. We just looked at each other, not knowing what to think. "How did this get here?" he murmured, confused. I kept quiet. The concrete was still fresh, and those tiny tracks were right there, perfectly clear, impossible to ignore. But there were no children around. I felt a chill up my neck. I gestured for him to cover them up. We went back to work as if nothing had happened. But the feeling that something didn't want us to continue building grew stronger. Tools disappeared mysteriously. We'd search everywhere for hours, to no avail. The next day, the missing object would turn up again, unharmed, right where we had already looked. Nights became heavier. Dinner conversations fell into uncomfortable silence. Anderson complained that the food wouldn't keep, spoiling too fast. That particular night, no one wanted to talk. The air felt charged. Until Saulo broke the silence. "There's something very wrong here." His voice was deep, serious, and I knew he was right. He said there was something strange about this place, and he wasn't wrong. By then, we all felt it. The unease hovered in the air, heavy, suffocating. It was impossible to ignore the sense of being watched. Perhaps each of us had already witnessed something inexplicable, but no one spoke of it. Even so, the work had to continue. We couldn't just drop everything and leave. That wasn't an option. The people who hired us were not to be trifled with, and we didn't want to find out what would happen if we gave up. Fear had many faces, and this was one of them. The nights were strangely silent. It was as if in some way we were trapped there. Time passed. The construction advanced. We woke up early, raised the walls, checked every detail. But when the sun went down, the strange came back. Distant screams, unexplainable sounds among the trees. We did our best to ignore them. We brought our hammocks inside the house, barricaded the door with a piece of wood. We didn't know exactly what we were defending ourselves from, but sleeping that way felt safer. Until then, I hadn't told anyone about the man on the horse. I kept it to myself. My men were my foundation. If they broke, I would fall apart too. That afternoon, 3 of us were preparing dinner in the house. Fabio, the 4th worker, went out to the bathroom, the improvised spot among the trees. He took longer than usual, but no one worried until we heard the scream. It was his voice. He appeared running, terrified, eyes wide, skin pale. Something was chasing him. He kept repeating that over and over. Anderson tried to calm him, but when Fabio turned around, we saw the cuts across his back. It was as if someone had driven thorns into him. Panic swept over us. He was shirtless, barefoot, trembling. His eyes were fixed on the door. Anderson slammed it shut and insisted that Fabio calm down, but he kept repeating, "Something's after me." We tried to tell him he was safe now, that it was over, but he wouldn't listen. Only when Saulo began cleaning his wounds did he finally manage to breathe. Still nervous, voice shaky, he told us what he had seen. "It was a man with no teeth. He ran after me." My chest tightened. Anderson wanted to know who caused the cuts. They looked like they were made by branches with thorns. But Fabio shook his head. It was him, he insisted, a tall, pale guy hiding among the trees. We fell silent. After a few minutes, Fabio began to recount everything. I had only walked a few steps in. I was finishing up when I heard footsteps deeper in. I thought it was one of you. I got ready to head back, but I noticed something moving among the branches, jumping from one branch to another. He swallowed hard. Then I saw it up in the branches, watching me. It was someone or something that looked like a person. His voice faltered. He was staring at me from up there, and I just ran. The strange noise it made was what bothered me first. In the darkness, I could see its face wasn't like a normal person's. The mouth was huge, partly open, and from what I saw, toothless. The thin, pulled-back lips gave the impression of a grin that was terrifying enough on its own, but what truly horrified me were its eyes. So wide, they looked ready to pop out of the sockets. The image of that deformed expression fixed itself in my mind, the way that grotesque face emerged among the foliage. The sound that came from its mouth got louder, forcing me to back away. I thought it would end there, but when the creature came down from the tree and started toward me, I froze. The way it moved was bizarre, unstable, like it had no control over its own legs. When it stopped in front of me, I realized it was almost my height, wrapped in a black cloak covering its entire body. It let out a low laugh and drew closer. That was all it took for me to bolt. But before I could get away, that thing let out a horrifying scream, and in the blink of an eye, appeared right in front of me, blocking my path. I couldn't fathom how it moved so fast. Terrified, I tried telling it I was leaving, that I didn't want trouble, but it just stared at me with those insane eyes. The moment I thought to run in another direction, it attacked. Its skeletal hands dug into my shoulders, throwing me against a tree. Its face got so close I could smell its foul breath, something like burnt meat. Its touch was icy, cold enough to make me shiver. Then, with absurd strength, it began slamming me into the tree again and again. Its twisted lips, that huge empty mouth, were right in front of me, laughing like a lunatic. My skin burned. My back felt like it was being cut by invisible blades. It shook me violently. Its screams mixed with mine while I tried in vain to break free. It was so close that its monstrous face vibrated before my eyes. The terror consumed me. I struggled, shouted, begged it to stop, but it was far too strong. I squeezed my eyes shut, not wanting to see that horror anymore. I begged it to leave me alone, sobbed in desperation. The sound of insane laughter echoed in my head, with no way out. I don't know how long it lasted. I lost track of time. I only remember screaming until I ran out of breath, sobbing uncontrollably. Suddenly, everything stopped. The hands vanished from my shoulders, the laughter died away. Still trembling, I opened my eyes. There was nothing there. Just the darkness of the trees, quiet and empty. Without thinking twice, I ran as fast as I could toward the house, shouting all the way, terrified that thing might come back. Fabio was crying in front of us like a terrified child. The silence that descended on the room was heavy. No one dared to breathe too loudly. We were all pale, covered in goosebumps, as if we had seen the creature through his eyes. It was hard to believe, but there was something real about it. For a moment I considered if he might be under the influence of something, but that thought vanished quickly. The cuts on his back, the trembling in his voice, the sheer terror in his gaze, everything proved it had been very real to him. No one could eat that night. We stayed locked in, afraid even to look out the window. The stillness of the night felt more intense than usual, but it brought no comfort. None of us slept. Fabio cried for most of the night, and although we tried to console him, we were as frightened as he was. Lying in bed, shaking under the blankets, all I could think about was that thing that attacked him, and the terror that now haunted me too. The next day, our first move was to tell the men who brought our supplies about what was happening. We had to report the strange events, and especially Fabio's attack. We feared something even worse might occur, but the truth was we were at a loss. We had no idea what we were dealing with. The words of the man on the black horse echoed in my mind. These lands and your boss are cursed. The apparitions, like the woman washing her feet, the shadowy horseman, the baby's cry, the small footprints in the cement, and now that thing that harmed Fabio, all seemed connected. But how? Was it a single entity taking different shapes, or something even more complicated? I knew nothing about these things, but Anderson had his theories. He said his grandmother had practiced witchcraft for years, and from what he knew of the stories, this went far beyond a simple spell. He suspected the boss had made some kind of pact. If he was already involved in illegal dealings, it made sense that he might seek spiritual protection. Maybe something had gone wrong, and now this evil presence roamed that land, tormenting us. We weren't certain of anything, but we agreed to halt construction. Maybe that being wanted us out of there. We also agreed that nobody would go off alone. The more time we spent together, the better. We waited for the boss's men to arrive so we could talk about the situation, but they never showed up on the scheduled day, nor the next. 3 days passed without a sign of anyone. Our worry grew. It was strange that no one came by to check on our progress, or at least bring food. Luckily, we still had some canned goods. By the 4th day, the tension had us on edge, and Saulo suggested we leave. No one was coming, and the pressure only got worse. We hadn't seen another attack since Fabio's encounter, but the sense of being watched remained constant. We were on high alert. I was the one who insisted that we wait a little longer. Someone had to come, but the others were too frightened to listen. Many of them feared for their families and just wanted to get out. Fabio, the most shaken, pulled me aside. His voice trembled as he told me he was leaving the next day, with or without me. Terror was etched into his face. I slowly realized everyone was against my idea of staying. I understood their reasons, but wanted them to understand mine. If I ran away without finishing the job, my family might pay the price. The thought alone made me shudder. Even so, deep down I also wanted to leave. I asked them to be patient, tried to convince them we needed a plan. But it was no use. If nobody showed up the next day, they would leave. Their plan was simple. Head down the road until we reached some village, then continue on to our hometown. The problem was that we didn't really know where we were. Frustrated, I told them to do whatever they wanted. I left the house and walked some distance away, needing time to think. What was I supposed to do? Stay or go? Neither option seemed good. I only knew one thing. I didn't want to be alone in that land. I walked to a section of the river and crouched down, letting my hands sink into the water. To my surprise, it was warm. The trees around it reflected the orange glow of late afternoon, creating a peaceful setting. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself before returning to discuss plans with the others, in case something went wrong. I looked up, and on the opposite bank I saw my wife, my chest filled with joy. It was her, with loose hair and that face I loved so much, sitting by the water. She was so close, only a few yards away. Without hesitation, I called her name, but she didn't answer. She simply stood up and, without looking at me, stepped into the water, swimming toward the center of the river, as if I weren't even there. I didn't understand a thing, but happiness overwhelmed me. Without thinking, I dove in and started swimming after her. My heart pounded. I was overcome by emotion. I could see her back just ahead of me, and I kept saying how happy I was, how I had waited so long to hold her again. But she didn't respond. She just kept swimming, ignoring my words. When I got close enough, I put my hands on her shoulders. Her skin was icy, but I didn't care. I wrapped my arms around her from behind, letting my lips brush her neck. My body pressed against hers, feeling the presence I had so longed for. Then she turned around. The scream I let out tore through the river's silence. What I saw froze me in sheer horror. Her face had no eyes. The skin was gray and rotting, like a corpse decomposing for days. I tried to pull away, but that thing seized me in a crushing embrace, dragging me closer. Then it began to scream, a deep, distorted sound that made my chest vibrate. I struggled, trying to break free, but its arms held me with inhuman strength. My breath gave out. Water filled my mouth. The current tugged at us, and the more I fought, the tighter that thing clung to me. Desperate, I tried to hit it, but it started smashing its head against mine, again and again. My vision dimmed. My body became heavy, my lungs filled with water. I was sinking. I begged God for help, begged for another chance. In one last burst of strength, I pushed that thing away. That was when I felt someone grabbing me under my arms. I fought to break free, but I stopped when I heard Saulo's voice. He was holding me firmly, dragging me to the bank. I barely understood what was happening. My throat burned as I struggled for air. Saulo said he saw me drowning and ran to help. "Didn't you see the woman?" I asked, still frantic. He shook his head. I looked around, searching everywhere, but there was nothing. The water was calm, as though nothing had happened, as though she had dissolved into the river. I returned to the house, trembling. My companions didn't need many details to figure out what had happened. The terror on my face said it all. Now we had no doubt. We had to leave that place. Deep inside, I was still terrified, but I was also fearful for my family. What would happen if we fled without finishing the job? Even so, our decision was unanimous. We packed our things. We didn't know what awaited us on the road, but one thing was certain: we wouldn't stay to find out. We thought of leaving that very night, but just the idea of what we might encounter in the dark made us abandon the plan. We spent the night awake, waiting for the first sign of daylight to head down the road. I tried to block from my mind the decaying face of that woman, the eyeless screams still echoing in my ears. We had no idea exactly where we were, but we clung to the hope of finding some town, and from there making our way home. I'm not sure how long we walked, but it was late when we spotted a tiny hamlet, with just a few houses scattered around. An old lady, sitting in her yard, watched us warily before finally agreeing to help. We decided not to say who we were or why we were there, so we just asked which larger city was closest. She cautiously gave us directions, warning that we still had a few hours of walking ahead. But each step that took us away from that place felt like an indescribable relief. Night was already falling when we reached a bigger town. Fortunately, we recognized the region. From there, it was only a matter of time before we got home. My heart pounded as I picked up the phone to call my family. The fear that something had happened to them consumed me, but I had to hear their voices. When my wife answered, I broke down. I cried with relief, knowing she was alive, our children were safe. I tried to explain, my voice choked up, that we couldn't see each other yet, but that soon we would be together. That's when she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. She said it was all over the news. A key local leader had been taken down, along with several members of the Manya working for him. My mind spun. I could barely form words as I asked if she was sure. She confirmed. And everything suggested it was the same man who had taken me to build the mountain house. That revelation put everything into perspective. That was why no one had shown up in those last days. He'd been caught. A chill went through me. I didn't know whether to feel relief or horror. The only certainty was that I was alive and he could no longer reach me. Even so, I couldn't shake my anxiety. I begged my wife to be careful, to move elsewhere until I arrived. The wait to see them again was agonizing, an eternity. But when I finally got to hold her, the weight of everything I'd been through crashed down all at once. I cried like never before. My family was safe. Nothing else mattered. I didn't share many details about what happened on that ranch, but I did seek out healers and spiritual cleansings. I felt something heavy inside me, like I'd brought something back that didn't belong to me. In the newspapers, that man's face was plastered on every headline. There was no doubt it was him. But I didn't want to know anything more. Whatever he had done, whoever else he had ruined, was no longer my concern. The important thing is that it ended this way. He deserved a fate far worse than prison. And deep down, I hoped all that had haunted us on that ranch would go after him now, that it would never let him rest. There was a certain comfort in imagining that buried in the darkness of the earth, he'd pay for all the souls he condemned. My name is Nayara. I spent my childhood in a remote village in northern Zacatecas, a mountainous state in Mexico known for its arid landscapes and historic colonial cities, surrounded by towering mountains and a dry air that seemed to carry echoes of ancient stories. Ever since I was little, I felt a restlessness I couldn't name, as if my path had already been laid out before I could choose my own way. I was 18 years old when I met Romulo. He had just arrived in the village, and the moment our eyes met, something inside me changed. We quickly grew close, and within a few months, we were inseparable. My mother, however, always kept her distance toward him. She said foreigners only brought trouble, and that I was too young to give myself over to someone so unpredictable. Despite her warnings, I stayed with Romulo. For 5 years we dreamed together, Talking about marriage, traveling all over Mexico, and building a new life far away became routine. But then, without any warning, he disappeared. No goodbye, no note, no rumor to explain his departure. The emptiness he left shattered me. At that time, without cell phones, letters were the only means of contact. I waited for months, then years, certain that he would come back or at least send an explanation. My mother insisted that I move on, repeating that a man who disappears like that never truly loved anyone. But her words sounded less like advice and more like orders. Over time, I stopped waiting. By the time I turned 30, I was already seen as a woman who had lost her chances. My friends and siblings got married, built families, while I watched everything from a distance, like a spectator in a play where I never had a role. My mother, on the other hand, seemed content to keep me by her side. She repeated that no one would ever love me like she did, and that my duty was to stay there, taking care of her, especially after my father's death when I was 25. Over the years, our relationship deteriorated. Although she claimed she needed me, her behavior grew cruel. She would ridicule me in front of her friends, blame me for any inconvenience, until one day words gave way to violence. I couldn't understand how someone who said she loved me could hurt me like that. My life was reduced to being her caregiver. No job, no friends, no expectations of change. Every attempt to leave that situation was blocked by something invisible, as if forces beyond my control kept me trapped. It went on like that for years until at 50 my mother passed away. I felt a whirlwind of emotions that were hard to name. The sadness came after all. She was my only close family. But along with it came a strange relief, as if for the first time in decades I could breathe without a shadow suffocating me. However, that was only the beginning of the real storm. Among the belongings my mother left behind, I came across things that unsettled me. Small bundles covered by black cloth, figures sculpted in wax, and a letter addressed to someone called the Godmother. The contents of the letter were confusing but mentioned protection and binding rituals. At that moment, it dawned on me that maybe my mother had been involved in something far deeper than I ever could have imagined. Months later, while cleaning the house to sell it, I discovered something even more disturbing. Under her bed, inside an old trunk, there was a black wooden box with my name engraved on it. I opened it hesitantly and found pieces of clothing that belonged to me, a lock of my hair and several ribbons tied in an intricate manner. I didn't fully understand what I was looking at, but a wave of anguish washed over me. Something inside whispered that this was the root of many of the torments I had carried throughout my life. The moment I held that box, a chill ran down my spine. Fear took hold of my senses, and I left the object on the dining room table, unable to face it again. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I tried to rest, images of the objects in the box invaded my mind, accompanied by the sensation that something was watching me in the darkness. The following day, I decided to seek help. I didn't know exactly whom to turn to, but I remembered there was a woman in the village known as the Healer. Her name was Dona Marisa. I'd never been one to believe in such things, but something inside me insisted that I needed to hear what she had to say. When I arrived at Dona Marisa's house, I was greeted by a heavy gaze. I had barely begun to explain what I had found before she asked me to bring the box to her. I went back right away, carried the object with extreme care, and hurried to return. When Dona Marisa opened the box, her eyes turned somber. She didn't need many words. Just one look confirmed what I feared. My mother practiced witchcraft. Examining each item carefully, Dona Marisa explained that my mother hadn't performed a typical binding, like those aimed at keeping two people in a relationship. The purpose was different, to ensure I would never leave, that I would remain there, tied to her like a caged bird. According to Dona Marisa, the items in the box not only affected my emotional life, but could also be responsible for physical problems. I told her that ever since I turned 35, I had been experiencing constant pain in my arms and legs, something doctors always attributed to the natural wear and tear of the body. However, Dona Marisa insisted that these pains were not normal. She said the ritual not only kept me emotionally bound, but also prevented me from living a full life. from finding happiness or forming my own family. Following her instructions, I began scouring the house for more evidence. She warned that it was rare for such rituals to be done in isolation. If there was one binding, there were likely others hidden as well. She suggested I look in the least obvious places, especially my mother's bedroom and the neglected corners of the house. I returned home filled with a mixture of fear and determination. I started in her room, opening drawers, rummaging through closets, and exploring every nook. I found more packages wrapped in black cloth hidden in an old wardrobe behind the ceiling beams, and even buried in flower pots in the yard. With each new discovery, the scope of what my mother had done became clearer, revealing that for years my life had been tied to something much bigger than I could have ever imagined. Among the items, I found wax figures with names etched on them. I was shocked to immediately recognize the names of my brothers, Tiago and Davi. In that instant, I realized I wasn't the only one affected by my mother's rituals. She had used her witchcraft to manipulate not just my life, but our entire families, ensuring we would always be dependent on her. The following day, I took everything to Donna Marisa. Patiently, she examined each piece and explained that each represented a different form of control. Mine was the most elaborate, a sign that my mother had devoted time and energy to making sure I could never escape her influence. To break these bindings, a ritual would be necessary. Donna Marisa warned me it wouldn't be a simple or immediate process. After so many years under that influence, the effects wouldn't vanish overnight. My presence in the ritual was essential for ensuring my complete liberation. That night at her house, Donna Marisa began the ritual. She lit candles, burned herbs, and recited prayers in a language I didn't fully understand. She asked me to hold the black box as she worked. As the ritual went on, an intense pressure grew in my chest and a sharp pain shot through my legs, as if something inside me was struggling to remain. When it was over, she assured me that we had made progress, but remnants of the binding still lingered. To free myself completely, a second ritual would be needed, this time in my own home. And there was a danger. The process could stir up negative energies that would try to stop us. That night, the nightmares began. I dreamed of my mother watching me from the corner of the room. Her gaze was disapproving, her smile vicious. I woke up feeling as though the air around me was dense, heavy, like an invisible presence was still there. The following day, I made my decision. I called Donna Marisa and asked her to perform the final ritual. She agreed, but warned me that I had to be prepared for what we might find. That same afternoon, she arrived accompanied by her grandson, Lucas, a young man around 20 who had inherited part of her knowledge and skills. They both carried bags filled with herbs, candles, and ritual instruments. Lucas wore a serious, almost solemn expression, as though he knew what we were about to face wouldn't be easy. Before beginning, Donna Marisa walked through the house in silence. In one hand, she held a metal bowl that produced a vibrating sound whenever she tapped it lightly with a small rod. She explained that this sound helped reveal hidden energies in the environment. Moving from room to room, she'd close her eyes and breathe deeply in some spots, as if sensing something I couldn't perceive. The sweep ended in my bedroom. Donna Marisa pointed to the floor beneath my bed. Firmly, she said there was something buried there. That's when I remembered. Years ago, when my father was still alive, we had renovated the bedroom and replaced the dirt floor with concrete. The revelation was overwhelming. My mother had taken advantage of that renovation to hide something right under the floor where I slept every night. With Lucas's help, we began breaking through the concrete. It was exhausting work, and with each hammer blow, the atmosphere seemed to grow denser, as though the air itself was thickened by something invisible. When we finally lifted the last pieces of concrete, we found a small black wooden box, sealed with wax, and wrapped in multiple layers of fabric. Lucas handed it to his grandmother, who examined it carefully before opening it. Inside, there was a rag doll crudely made. The shock was immediate. I recognized the scraps of fabric. They were from my clothes that had disappeared over the years. Marisa explained that this figure was a binding spell meant to keep me emotionally and physically tied to my mother. Next to it was a letter written with reversed prayers, reinforcing the ritual. While Marisa and Lucas worked to undo the spell, I continued searching the house. In every corner, I found hidden evidence, in dusty vases, behind furniture, and even in the attic. a dark space I had never explored. With each new discovery, I felt a mix of horror and sadness. How could my own mother do this to me? With all the objects gathered, the purification ritual began. Marissa placed candles in the four corners of the house and burned a mixture of herbs, filling the air with a strong but comforting aroma. As she chanted prayers out loud, Lucas drew symbols on the floor with salt and ashes. I stayed nearby, holding a rosary Marissa had given me for protection. As the ritual progressed, strange things began to happen. The candle's flames flickered violently, even though there was no draft. Subtle noises seemed amplified inside the house, and at one point, I heard what sounded like distant footsteps, despite knowing we were alone. Marissa looked up and warned me to stay firm, no matter what happened. Some energies, she said, fight hard not to be banished and can manifest aggressively, but fear only makes them stronger. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the living room. Lucas rushed to check while Marissa kept reciting her prayers. He found a fallen picture, a painting that had belonged to my mother. When he picked it up, he noticed a small bundle of black cloth behind the frame. Marissa wasted no time. She said that might be the most potent spell of them all. She burned it along with the other objects, and the moment the flames consumed the last remnant, I felt something detach from me. A lightness washed over my body as though a burden I'd carried for years had finally been lifted. The ritual went on for hours. When it ended, the atmosphere felt different. The air, once oppressive, now held an uncanny stillness. Marissa assured me my mother's witchcraft had been completely broken, but warned that the emotional and physical damage wouldn't disappear right away. That night, for the first time in a long while, I slept deeply. But upon waking, something made me doubt whether everything was truly over. On the windowsill of my bedroom, there were marks I didn't remember seeing before, long scratches, as if something had tried to get in. The marks on the windowsill unnerved me. They were too deep, long and precise to be caused merely by time or animals. I tried convincing myself it was just a coincidence, but something in me insisted that I shouldn't ignore them. The following day, I called Donna Marissa and told her what I had found. She asked me to stay calm and check if there were similar signs in other parts of the house. Following her advice, I examined every corner, and what I found made me shudder. The markings were on other windowsills, on doors, and even on some walls. It was as if something had roamed around the house for years without me noticing. Marissa arrived that same day, accompanied by Lucas. They brought new instruments for a second ritual, suggesting there could be something else attached to the house, something we hadn't detected before. According to her, the power of my mother's binding spells could have attracted dark energies that now refused to leave. The new ritual began at dusk. This time, Marissa focused on the marks and the places where activity seemed most intense. She anointed the scratches with a dark liquid while chanting prayers in Nahuatl, an ancient language she said was especially potent against negative forces. Meanwhile, Lucas burned incense and drew protective circles around the most critical areas. As the ritual progressed, the environment grew charged. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe. The candles wavered strangely, as though an invisible current were running through them. Then, a loud thud broke the silence. Something heavy fell onto the roof. Lucas grabbed a flashlight and climbed up to check, but he found nothing. Marissa, however, wasn't surprised. She said physical manifestations were common when these forces were challenged. She told me not to touch anything without her guidance. The strangest moment happened when we approached the windowsill in my bedroom. Marissa sprinkled the dark liquid over the scratches, and immediately a biting cold filled the room. A shiver ran up my spine, and for a brief moment I felt like something was watching me. Lucas, beside me, stifled a gasp and pointed to the windowsill. Above the scratches, the liquid started spreading in a peculiar pattern, almost forming words. None of us could decipher what was written, but Marissa said it was a warning, a final attempt by whatever was still holding on. When we finished, the house felt lighter, though not entirely calm. Marissa assured me we had made significant progress, but warned that my mother's story wasn't over yet. According to her, the bindings were just one part of the damage that had been done. There were still traces we'd need to uncover. That night I had a strange dream. I saw my mother sitting in her old rocking chair with her usual rigid, severe expression, but saying nothing. Her gaze was fixed on me, and in it there was something I had never seen before: fear. I woke up gasping, feeling that the dream was more of a warning than a random illusion. The next day, I decided to revisit my mother's belongings and documents stored away since she died. Among the keepsakes, I found old letters addressed to someone named Senor Otavio. In them, my mother described in detail the rituals she performed and asked for advice on how to protect herself from potential backlash. From the tone of the letters, I realized Otavio wasn't just a friend, but a mentor in the occult arts, someone who guided her through magic and witchcraft. One of the letters mentioned a place I recognized immediately: an abandoned cabin on the outskirts of the village, deep in a wooded area. I remembered that when I was a child, my mother would disappear for hours at a time, saying she was gathering medicinal herbs. Now I understood her true intentions went far beyond that. I called Marisa and told her what I had discovered. She insisted I shouldn't go there alone, warning that the place might be infused with dangerous energies. With Lucas by my side, we prepared for the visit. When we arrived, we found the cabin overrun by vegetation and on the verge of collapse, exuding an unsettling air of abandonment. But the moment we stepped inside, it became clear it wasn't entirely deserted. In the center of the main room, there was a makeshift altar filled with unlit candles, strange figures, and small vials of dark liquids. Marisa inspected the site carefully and confirmed that this altar had been at the heart of my mother's practices. To sever any remaining connections, we would need to destroy it. However, she first had to perform a ritual to make sure any lingering energy wouldn't harm us. While she prepared the necessary items, she cautioned me not to approach the altar, as simply touching it could be dangerous. Lucas began tracing circles of protection around us, using salt and ashes. The atmosphere grew heavier, as though an unseen presence was watching. Marisa lit candles and burned strongly scented herbs, filling the air with smoke. She began murmuring prayers while Lucas poured a dark liquid over the altar's objects. As the ritual progressed, cold seeped into the cabin. Suddenly, a loud creak echoed from the roof, as if something was moving above us. Lucas shone his flashlight around but found nothing. Marisa, unflinching, explained that physical manifestations often occurred when these forces were challenged. She told me to stay strong and not give in to fear. A black cloth covered the altar and Marisa carefully removed it. Underneath, there was a wax box engraved with unknown symbols. Opening it, we found old photographs, scraps of clothing I recognized as mine, and small vials with mysterious liquids. Among the items, there was also a notebook filled with handwritten notes, which Marisa set aside to examine later. The ritual continued. Marisa fed the items to the flames one by one. Every time something burned, I felt a pressure in my chest, as if something were being ripped out of me. She explained that these items were tied to the bindings and energies my mother had summoned. Destroying them was the only way to permanently break whatever still linked me to her. The most intense moment came when Lucas threw the notebook onto the fire. The flames turned blue, crackling fiercely, as though something were resisting. A sharp odor filled the air, and for a split second, I had the distinct impression that an invisible presence was trying to escape the cabin. Marisa intensified her prayers, while Lucas reinforced the protective circles around us. When the flames finally died out, the atmosphere changed. The oppressive weight we had felt vanished, replaced by an eerie quiet. Marisa assured us that we had passed the most critical phase, but warned that there were still steps to be taken. According to her, it was crucial to seal off the place so no residual energy could resurface. We used the remaining salt and ashes to draw protective symbols around the cabin's entrance and windows. After we locked up, we walked away without looking back. On our way back to the village, Marisa reminded me that complete freedom would take time. The impact of years of occult practices wouldn't vanish overnight. That night back home, I delved into the documents I had brought from the cabin. Among them, I found more letters my mother had written, all referring to a man named Otavio. According to her accounts, he had been her mentor in the occult and the one who designed many of the bindings she used. One of the letters was addressed to me. My mother's shaky handwriting revealed hesitation. In it, she begged for forgiveness. She confessed to acting out of fear of loneliness, especially after my father threatened to leave her once the children went their own ways. She admitted resorting to witchcraft to keep him by her side and keep us close, never considering the consequences. Her words sounded sincere, but they brought no relief. No letter could erase the years of pain I endured. Even so, I decided to save it, not as a reminder of the hurt, but as a reminder of what I would never allow to happen again. The following day, Donna Marisa stopped by to see how I was. I showed her the documents and the letter. She suggested keeping them as evidence of what we had faced. She also advised me to consider selling the house and moving away, explaining that physical spaces retain memories and energies, which could make my recovery more difficult. The decision was not easy, but after a few weeks I followed her advice. I sold the house and moved to a small coastal town. I bought a simple but cozy home, where for the first time in a long while, I felt I could start fresh. My new life brought changes. I met Santiago, a widower with 2 young children. At first it was hard to adjust, still burdened by the fear that my past might catch up to me. But as time went by, I felt the weight on my chest gradually easing. Little by little, I allowed myself to believe life might still hold something good in store for me. Santiago's presence and that of his children was fundamental to my emotional healing. They welcomed me with a genuine warmth I had never experienced, and slowly I found solace in simple moments, sharing breakfast, strolling along the beach, hearing the children's laughter echo through the house. As time went on, Santiago and I decided to get married. I never imagined my life would take this path, but I embraced this new stage with gratitude. His children started calling me Mommy Nayara, and their affection sparked a deep sense of belonging in me. Even so, the past still surfaced in my dreams. Sometimes I saw my mother. Other times, images of the objects I found in her house or of the altar in the cabin would appear. I'd wake up anxious, but I clung to what Donna Marisa had told me. Time and love are the most powerful tools for healing old wounds. One day, while organizing my home, I came across the letter my mother had written to me. It was difficult, but I decided to read it again. Something within me shifted as I did. For the first time, I didn't feel just pain. I also felt a strange sense of understanding. My mother had been a woman consumed by fear and loneliness. Though her acts were unforgivable, I could see they were born from despair. That realization led me to visit Donna Marisa once more. I wanted to thank her and ask for advice on how to truly close this chapter. She welcomed me with her serene gaze and a firm hug. I told her about my dreams and the confusion of feelings I still had toward my mother. She listened in silence, and when I finished, she said something I've never forgotten. Forgiveness isn't a gift for the one who hurt us, but a liberation for ourselves. She suggested I perform a small farewell ritual, not a spell, but a symbolic act to release the past. That night I followed her instructions. I lit a white candle and placed the letter in front of me. I reread every word, allowing myself to feel everything, the sadness, the relief, and finally, peace. When I was done, I burned the paper and watched the smoke carry away the years of weight I had borne. When the last ember died out, I felt as though an invisible door had closed. In the following days, something inside me felt lighter. The scars of the past would remain, but they no longer held power over me. Santiago and I continued on our journey together, and soon grandchildren arrived, bringing unexpected joy to our home. Whenever they called me Grandma Nayara, a warmth spread in my chest, like I had finally found my place in the world. The past never ceased to exist, but I learned to view it as a teacher, not a shadow. Witchcraft haunted my life for years, but in the end I discovered that true freedom didn't come from rituals or ancient words. It came from love and the courage to let go of what no longer served me. Today, when I walk along the beach with my family, I look out at the horizon and feel grateful. My story didn't follow the path I expected, but perhaps that's what made it perfect. We don't always get what we wish for, but sometimes life gives us exactly what we need. My name is Carla, and it was during a college assignment that I came across this story. The task required us to interview a professional in our field who was actively working in the market, so we could better understand the challenges, benefits, and difficulties of the profession. At the time, I was studying veterinary medicine. The problem was that I didn't know many options for where to find this contact, but a close friend, Aline, mentioned a place in her mother's neighborhood. Besides offering veterinary consultations, they also ran large-scale campaigns to help animals, ranging from sterilization to adoption. They even maintained a small shelter for stray animals or those in need of special care. To be honest, I don't remember the exact name of the place, and it's been a long time since I last saw Aline to ask. The last thing I heard was that they had moved to a different location. Back then, everyone called it Father Isidro's shelter, in honor of the Catholic priest who founded it. It's said that he inherited a large piece of land from his family and decided to use it to take in abandoned animals. The shelter was located near a fork in the Cautín River, a waterway that runs through southern Chile, in a community area on the outskirts of the Miraflores neighborhood. By the time I visited the shelter, it was no longer in that location, but had moved closer to downtown Temuco, a city in southern Chile. That's where I heard the story. According to what people told me, Father Isidro opened the first shelter in 1983, and in that small branch of the Cautín River, he would bathe the dogs he rescued. He used to say that the water had miraculous properties and helped the animals recover. Of course, this was just a joke. As the woman who told me the story explained, she had actually met the priest in person. According to her, he openly admitted that the water wasn't special at all, but he asked people not to tell the animals that so they wouldn't lose their illusion. He truly loved those creatures. Tragedy struck unexpectedly. Father Isidro died in a severe car accident. His death left the community and the shelter's visitors lost and uncertain about the future. Since he had no family, there was no one to take over the property. The shelter itself required resources and continuous dedication, something difficult to maintain without strong leadership. Despite collective efforts, it was impossible to keep the place running. In the first few months after his death, the community tried to sustain the shelter, with some volunteers stepping up to take responsibility. However, without financial support and without the priest's charismatic leadership, keeping the shelter operational became increasingly difficult. Over time, the challenges piled up, and despite everyone's best efforts, the shelter eventually closed. The property remained vacant while the last of the animals were relocated. Many were taken to the city or to other communities, while some found refuge in veterinary clinics. However, not all of them were that lucky. Some ended up back on the streets relying on the kindness of locals. Others, still injured, never fully recovered. As the months passed, the locals began to notice something strange. Many of the dogs and cats that had once lived at the now abandoned shelter started returning. They would gather outside as if waiting for someone to open the door. Whenever they reappeared, they always seemed weak, wounded from fights, mistreatment, or accidents. This touched the hearts of the neighbors, who called veterinarians whenever they could. Over time, these professionals noticed a pattern. The injured animals always showed up there at the old shelter entrance. But something even stranger started happening. When veterinarians arrived, they often heard reports that the animals were no longer at the shelter but near the river, in the same fork of the Cautín, where Father Isidro had bathed them years before. According to the locals, in cases where the animals weren't found injured, they would enter the water, stay there for a while, and then, days later, seem healed. Always in that same part of the river. The woman who told me this story swore she had never actually seen an animal enter the water and get better, but she had treated several completely soaked animals that, according to the neighbors, could barely walk the day before. The most astonishing part was that, in some cases, the injuries were so severe that, under normal circumstances, the animals would have only recovered with veterinary intervention. However, by the time the professionals arrived, the animals were already much better. And that's how the legend began. The small river fork where the priest once bathed the rescued animals had become a place of healing. For those who lived there, that piece of water had been made to save them. Over time, the number of injured dogs and cats diminished. They were no longer as common as before. Later, a small veterinary clinic was built in the area, though it wasn't large enough to function as a shelter. There simply wasn't enough demand for adoptions in that region. In response, the same people who once helped the priest opened a new shelter in the city where they could take in more animals. As for the river, it remained for a few more years, but eventually dried up. The waterway disappeared as if it had fulfilled its purpose. For the locals and for the woman who shared this story with me, it felt like a symbolic closure, a cycle coming to an end. Perhaps now that another shelter and a new clinic existed, that stretch of river was no longer needed. Did this story happen exactly like this? Many might doubt it, but the woman who told me, with her voice trembling as she spoke, believed every word. She had never witnessed the exact moment of healing, but she had seen the soaked, recovered animals and heard the testimonies of those who had observed everything up close. That was enough to make her rethink many things. The unexplained doesn't always have to bring fear. While most of the stories we share here are meant to terrify, some evoke something different: curiosity, questions, a desire to understand what lies beyond what we know. These stories don't just intrigue us, they remind us that the world is filled with events that have no clear answers. For years, my path has taken unexpected turns, despite my background in criminal law and photography. What began as a side interest ended up leading me to an unconventional secondary job: paranormal investigation. And to be clear, I'm not someone who makes a living from social media. Quite the opposite, actually. There's a reason I don't publicly expose my findings, and it's partly related to something I experienced in my youth, or rather something we experienced. At the time I didn't realize it, but some experiences from our younger years leave invisible marks. Certain events hide in our memory until something brings them back, and one of them in particular still followed me even if I wasn't aware of it. Perhaps that was the first sign that my path was being traced before I even knew it. The main reason for my discretion, however, is a confidentiality agreement I signed a long time ago and continue to renew. It provides me with excellent financial compensation, allowing me to balance my legal work with the investigations I conduct in a small company specializing in the paranormal. It's within this setting that the agreement remains in effect. I believe it's important to explain, even briefly, the nature of this work. Our team deals with delicate situations involving paranormal phenomena. We collect and analyze evidence to understand what's really happening and rule out conventional explanations. At first, I imagined we'd be searching for strange voice recordings in cemeteries or trying to capture presences in supposedly haunted houses. I thought the job was about identifying what was disturbing a certain place, naming it, and then passing the case on to specialists responsible for resolving the problem. But I soon realized it wasn't that simple. To my surprise, most of the cases we investigate involve possessions. It's not that they misled me about the nature of the work, but in the beginning, we dealt with homes where families reported sleepless nights, objects breaking without explanation, and shadows crossing through walls. All of it duly documented. Even so, we don't have any irrefutable visual proof like a clear image of a ghost. What we usually manage to record are orbs, small luminous spheres that appear in recordings and photographs, often attributed to dust particles, but that, in certain cases, behave in inexplicable ways. In addition, we capture psychophonies, sounds or voices that show up in recordings for no apparent reason, as if they were picked up from another frequency or plane, and gather other evidence that remains stored without ever being made public. The reason for this confidentiality comes from two main sources: the people in charge of the company, who want total control over the collected material, and the priests involved in the cases. And honestly, I completely understand the need for secrecy. Keeping our work away from prying eyes prevents sensitive information from falling into the wrong hands. Now, how did I end up in this field if there isn't an official course for training paranormal investigators, at least not in Mexico? It happened through a college friend. We often discussed the supernatural, especially in the later years of our studies, until one day he suggested I get in touch with someone who could lead me down that path. And so, without realizing it, I was pulled into a world that went far beyond my legal background. That's how I found myself fitting the profile this company was looking for. Small only in terms of the number of members, because financially they're doing very well. In fact, they refuse any case that can't be classified as a paranormal phenomenon. Even if the offer is high, if it doesn't fit, they won't take it. They're extremely careful about their reputation and, as a result, have become widely recognized in the field, which ensures a steady flow of work. My academic background played an important role in all of this. Even though I didn't finish my photography course, choosing instead to focus on law, both contributed to my arrival here. But the real motivation behind that choice only became clear to me years later, and I'll talk about that further on. Over the years, we've worked with 3 different priests. They're the only people who treat these events with the seriousness required, whether it's a less intense situation or something more severe like a possession. For each case, we follow strict protocols to eliminate any other possibility before labeling it as paranormal. One of the first steps is ruling out medical explanations, including psychiatric disorders. Only when those alternatives are excluded does our real work begin. Maybe I'm going on too long, but it's important to clarify that we're not like some of those investigative groups that pop up in the media. I have no problem with appearing publicly, but I consider it dishonest to sell something that isn't real or to stage phenomena in order to display supposedly paranormal material. The truth is, obtaining legitimate evidence is extremely difficult. That said, I want to emphasize how seriously I take this job, as does the team, still small, and the priests, all from Nuevo León, a state in northeastern Mexico known for its industrial cities and religious traditions. They hold considerable influence, are sought out for various reasons, and when it comes to these occurrences, they devote themselves completely. Out of the countless cases I've followed under this contract, possessions always left the greatest impression on me. My role in these events isn't very hands-on. I record and analyze the evidence, we gather the necessary documentation, and once we confirm that it's a possession, we arrange the exorcism. In short, that means sending and receiving documents from the Vatican and Querétaro, contacting one of the priests from San Pedro, a wealthy area of Nuevo León where renowned clergy serve, and finally carrying out the rite. Most of the time, for spiritual and psychological safety, we're advised not to participate directly. We can be present if the family allows it, and when that happens, we film everything. However, the footage remains archived. In the first exorcisms I recorded, I kept my eyes fixed on the camera screen. It was my way of distancing myself a bit from what was happening there. Don't think the scenes resembled something from The Exorcist. I never witnessed any drastic changes in people's faces, though I've heard stories about that. Nor did I see anyone twisting their bodies in impossible ways or refusing eye contact. But even without those cinematic elements, the experience is terrifying. They're moments you don't forget. Sleepless nights become common after seeing something like that. I've seen things that defy any logical explanation. One of the most striking moments for me involved an 89-year-old lady, frail, with limited mobility. For a week, we observed her episodes of possession, gathered information, and ruled out any mental disorder or age-related condition. There was something else. Even the house itself gave us signs of it. We knew she had serious knee problems. She needed a cane just to stand. But that night, while we were recording the exorcism, something happened that still echoes in my memory today. The room suddenly turned cold, as it always does in these cases. We were all bundled up, praying silently, waiting for the moment to speak aloud if the priest asked. The prayer wasn't just for her, but for us as well, so nothing would latch on to anyone. Then, in the middle of the ritual, after nearly an hour of the priest trying to communicate with whatever was inside her, it happened. This woman, who could barely walk, sprang from the bed in a single movement. She stared at us for a few seconds and, with impossible speed for her age, ran into the room's bathroom. The door slammed shut. As soon as she went in, the light bulb shattered. We tried to open it immediately, but the doorknob simply wouldn't turn. We used cloths for a better grip. Someone with rough hands tried forcing it, but nothing worked. From inside, we heard 2 voices, not one after the other, but at the same time. Hers and a man's, hoarse, carrying a strange aggression. It was impossible she was faking it. How could anyone speak with 2 voices simultaneously, one overlapping the other? How could she respond to one provocation while speaking about something completely different? And that wasn't all. We could clearly hear sounds right next to the door, as if those voices were just inches away from us. But at the same time, the shower curtain was violently swaying back and forth. Suddenly, the shower rod fell. It made a loud metallic sound like aluminum. At that moment, the priest shouted a name, and what followed was absolute silence. It wasn't just a lack of sound. It was an oppressive void, unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. The door slowly opened. The lady came out, walking calmly, eyes fixed on the floor. But she moved without any difficulty, as if her mobility issues had never existed. The priest's assistant tried to help her, but the priest stopped him from touching her. Without saying a word, she walked back to the bed, lay down, and pulled the sheet up to her chest. She stayed there, motionless, staring at the ceiling, her eyes wide open. That night was unlike anything I had ever lived through. It made me realize that this kind of thing can happen in any home, in any family. And thankfully, we left there without taking anything with us. But as striking as that case was, it wasn't the one that affected me most. There was another. Something that, in the very moment it happened, brought to the surface memories I didn't even know were there. And it was only then I realized why my life had taken this course. We went to the municipality of Dr. Gonzalez, on the outskirts of Monterrey. It was a small town, even in 2020, about 2 weeks before the official start of the pandemic in Mexico. We already knew about the case, paranormal events that had escalated into a possession. What caught our attention, however, was the way the occurrences quickly spread to the house next door, owned by the same family. It didn't seem like a coincidence. Something about them made it easy for this to spread. When I say events, I'm referring to unexplained noises, footsteps interrupting the residents' sleep, until the moment people began getting pulled by the feet out of bed, first in one house, then in the other. In the first house, a 21-year-old girl, the daughter of a couple, already showed clear signs of possession. We sent all the documentation to Querétaro, where religious institutions responsible for evaluating exorcism cases are located, and the case was approved to proceed. Our time there was brief, no more than half an hour. The priest led the prayers while the girl apparently began to calm down. She sat up in bed, frightened, eyes full of tears, watching us. And then, out of nowhere, she laughed. It was the first time a possessed person had looked me straight in the eye. I knew I shouldn't maintain prolonged eye contact. Any priest would say that. But I couldn't look away. She stared at me with a gaze that didn't seem human, mocking me, saying things I'd rather not repeat, and something in her expression told me there was something terribly wrong. I stood there, frozen, holding the camera. That was my job. "Are you here with the priest to find Julio's 3 friends?" I didn't understand. I knew who Julio was if we were talking about the same person, but which friends was she referring to? What was she talking about? "If you stay in this house tonight, you'll find out who those 3 friends are." Then she said a name. At that moment, it didn't ring a bell. But the name stuck in my head, just like Julio. The priest watched silently, letting it go on, as if he were waiting for something. Suddenly, he started reciting a prayer in Latin, different from the ones I'd heard before, longer, more severe in tone. As he prayed, the girl shifted restlessly on the bed, lying down, sitting up, turning side to side, repeating the same name, the name I'd rather not say. And then, before fainting, she said something that made the priest lose his composure. She claimed Julio had asked for it. That's why it ended that way. And that, for that reason, those things never stopped following him. Just like that entity, which apparently had a name. The girl collapsed, unconscious. I did my best to hide how much it had affected me, but as soon as we left the house, it was as if everything inside me fell apart. The priest's assistant stayed with the family, along with part of the team. But the priest called me aside to talk in private. He didn't know anything about my past, had no idea what Julio meant to me, but he went straight to the point. "Is Julio still alive?" And he didn't even ask who Julio was. Right then, I suspected we were talking about the same person, the priest, that girl, and me. But who were the 3 friends she mentioned? With him, we were 3, at least in what we went through together. Were we the ones she was referring to? I asked him how he knew about Julio, just as the girl seemed to. He told me that ever since we'd arrived at that house, Someone had been whispering that name in the hallways, but he could never see who it was. He was the first to go in alone to speak with whoever was about to be set free, while I remained in the living room, hesitant. That girl told the priest that Julio's 3 friends might show up in that family's home that night. The priest wanted to know who she meant, and she replied that I, who, by the way, she knew exactly who I was very familiar with the Julio in question, the one who, years ago, had been looking for a solution to a family problem, and because of that, something happened that made us end that project. The priest warned me the name spoken by the girl shouldn't be taken lightly, but he assured me that I didn't need to worry. I was safe. Maybe even Julio himself was no longer in danger. That's why he asked if he was still alive. The issue was that, according to him, that name carried a dangerous weight, and Julio had some connection to all of this. In the days that followed, I couldn't get that name out of my head. Julio. We hadn't spoken in years, ever since things got complicated. Not between us. Our friendship remained strong, but his name echoed in my mind without rest. Night after night, I woke up startled, plagued by nightmares that quickly faded from memory. I used to be able to recall every detail of my dreams, recount them effortlessly. Not anymore. Only his name lingered when I woke up, often shouting, ruining my sleep for hours as I tried in vain to remember what I'd dreamed. That's when I realized I needed to reach out to those people. Without knowing anything about me, the priest had made me relive what happened, the reason we stopped. In that moment, I knew it was time to tell the story of when there were only 3 of us, Julio, Kaiki, and me, back when we still had that urban exploration project. Before we get to the last story, if you're still here, let me know what time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing who sticks around until the end. Let's not stop now. On to the next. My name is Camila Teresa, but most people call me Mila. I spent my childhood in a small, isolated village called San Miguel de los Sauces, deep in the heart of Guanajuato, Mexico. My life was simple, shaped by modest wishes, a home to call my own, food on the table every day, and maybe someday opening my own fabric store. But life has a peculiar way of changing our paths, and mine took a new turn when I crossed paths with Bruno Castelar. Bruno was from León, one of the biggest cities in Mexico and an economic hub of the region, a businessman whose name was synonymous with success. I met him back when I worked in a little shop in the center of the village, folding fabric and helping customers. The first time he walked in, his presence was impossible to ignore. Tall, confident, but without showing off. Unlike our usual customers, he carried a discreet elegance that immediately intrigued me. He was a man accustomed to luxury but without a hint of arrogance, and it was that authenticity that captivated me. Our romance blossomed quickly. By Bruno's side, I experienced a new feeling, something I'd never felt before: trips through León, dinners in places I never knew existed, gifts I never imagined receiving. Everything seemed straight out of a fairy tale, and when he asked me to marry him, I said yes without hesitation. I didn't dwell on details, like the contract he handed me one afternoon, saying it was just a formality. I didn't question it. At that moment, love seemed to justify everything. We moved into a magnificent house in an exclusive neighborhood in León. It was a world I had never dreamed of. Spacious rooms, sophisticated furniture, huge windows that let the sunlight in. For the first few months, I felt like I was living in a fairy tale, but I soon realized that the most beautiful places can hide the deepest loneliness. Bruno started spending less time at home. At first, it was the occasional meeting, then more and more frequent business trips. He tried to make up for it with gifts, but nothing filled the growing void inside me. The days dragged on as I roamed through the enormous halls, feeling more and more out of place. I tried to keep myself busy by taking handicraft classes at the neighborhood's club, but instead of feeling like I belonged, I felt even more distant. The women around me seemed to lead flawless lives, while I was turning into an ornament in my own home. Bruno would arrive late, often not even bothering to have dinner with me. A quick kiss on the forehead, a distracted look, and he'd lock himself in his office. The silence between us became deafening. I wanted to shout, to beg him to see me, but the words never found their way out. I tried convincing myself it was just a phase, that he was working so hard for our better life. But that explanation started to lose its meaning. After much insisting, he finally agreed to let us hire someone to help me with my daily tasks. And that's how Leandro Gallardo came into my life, a man in his 30s, discreet and always punctual. From the very first day, his presence brought a strange sense of peace. He never imposed himself, yet he was always attentive. At first, Leandro was just another employee. He'd drive me to the market, the club, to go shopping, always waiting patiently until I finished. But over time, his presence became something else. He always found a way to make the day a bit lighter, whether with a kind word or a comment that, however simple, felt sincere. "That dress looks really good on you, Ms. Mila." He said it with a discreet smile, and in that moment I felt truly seen, something I hadn't felt in a long time. One ordinary day, stuck in traffic, my anguish overflowed. Unable to hold back my emotions, I poured out how lonely I felt. Leandro didn't interrupt me. He just listened, nodding every now and then. When I finished, he only murmured, "Loneliness weighs less when it's shared." That phrase echoed within me for days. Our conversations became a refuge. Leandro talked about his childhood, how he grew up in a simple neighborhood, working to support his parents. There was something in the way he shared his life that made me feel connected again, a feeling that had long disappeared from my marriage. I was reluctant to admit it, but Leandro began to fill the empty space Bruno had left behind. That emotional connection soon became something deeper. After a grueling argument with Bruno, I got into the car and let the tears fall, unable to hold them back. Leandro drove me home in silence, respecting my pain. When we arrived, I hesitated before getting out. He noticed my discomfort and asked softly, "Do you need anything?" It was in that moment, in the silence between us, that our eyes met in a different way, carrying everything that hadn't been said. In the darkness of the car, the unthinkable happened. We kissed. And in that moment, a whirlwind of feelings took over me. Guilt and fear wrestled with the overwhelming sensation of being alive again. I knew crossing that line was a mistake, but at the same time I couldn't deny that Leandro offered me something I hadn't felt in years: warmth, attention, presence. Every time I saw Bruno, I felt a heaviness in my chest. His indifferent gaze seemed to pierce my skin, but he showed no sign of suspecting anything. I convinced myself that everything was under control, that I could keep it a secret. But as the days passed, my involvement with Leandro only intensified. He was always there, listening, comforting me, reminding me that I still mattered to someone. We began meeting outside of normal hours. Everything was done carefully, but each moment together mixed adrenaline and apprehension. I knew I was treading dangerous ground, yet it was impossible to stop. Leandro gave me what Bruno didn't even realize I was missing. After one of our encounters, I realized I needed to confide in someone. The only person I trusted was Rita. Our friendship dated back to San Miguel de los Sauces, a sisterhood built through laughter and hardships. Even though our lives had taken different paths, we never lost touch. I invited her over to my house one afternoon when Bruno was away on another of his endless trips. We sat in the kitchen, cups of coffee in our hands, and I told her everything. I talked about the suffocating loneliness, about Leandro, about the fear of ruining my own life. Rita listened without interrupting, her face serious, eyebrows slightly furrowed. When I finished, she crossed her arms and looked at me firmly before asking, "Are you sure about what you're doing, Mila?" Her tone was harsher than I expected. I tried to justify my feelings, to explain that I could no longer distinguish right from wrong, that Leandro had rekindled something in me that had been extinguished for a long time. But Rita kept the same closed expression. In the end, she said she understood, yet her voice sounded distant, almost mechanical. When she left that afternoon, an uneasiness took root in my chest, a disquiet that was hard to name. It didn't take long for everything to start falling apart. One unusual night, Bruno came home early. His gaze was different, charged with an intensity I hadn't seen in ages. He stared at me for a few seconds before asking in a firm voice with no pretense, "Is there something you want to tell me, Mila?" My breath caught, my heart pounded, but I tried to pretend. "I don't know what you're talking about." My answer came out shaky, unconvincing. Bruno folded his arms and took a deep breath before releasing the truth that froze my blood. "I know about Leandro. I know everything." Time stopped. My body went rigid. How could he know? No one else was aware of what was happening between us. No one except Rita. The shock of her betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to speak, but Bruno didn't give me a chance. "Don't bother denying it. She told me everything." The sharp tone of his voice shattered me. What followed was the most brutal argument of my life. Bruno, always so restrained, exploded. Every word he spat at me felt like a blade, throwing in my face all he had done for me, every luxury, every sacrifice. I wanted to argue, but there was no room for justifications. No excuse would be enough. When Leandro arrived that night to pick me up, Bruno was already waiting at the door. Before he could even get out of the car, Bruno proclaimed his fate with coldness. "You're fired, go away." Leandro tried to understand, asked what was happening, but under Bruno's furious stare, he simply lowered his head. He mumbled an apology and left without looking back. The sound of the engine fading away was like a final warning. Everything was over, but Bruno still wasn't done. He turned to me, his expression loaded with contempt. "You're going to leave this house, and you're not taking anything with you." He tossed an envelope onto the table. It was the prenuptial agreement. My stomach twisted. I picked up the papers with trembling hands. I had never stopped to read the details when I signed it. Back then, I believed love would be enough, that a perfect future was guaranteed. That night, with a suitcase in my hand, I left the house I once called home. Before I crossed the gates of Jardin de San Isidro, the luxury condominium, an exclusive area for Leon's elite, I looked back one last time, staring at that imposing facade that was now just a reminder of what I had lost. The weight of the contract and Rita's betrayal crushed me. I felt empty, directionless. How did I end up like this? What was left of me now? Returning to the small apartment where my parents lived was a stark reality check. The space felt cramped after everything I'd had. I no longer felt like the same person. On that first night, sitting on the bed that was once mine, I opened my suitcase, pulled out the contract, and for the first time, read every clause. Each sentence seemed to stare back at me, mocking my naivety. The rules were clear. If I was unfaithful, I would lose any right to the assets acquired during the marriage. Bruno had planned everything from the start, and I, blinded by what I believed to be love, had signed without question. What hurt the most wasn't just realizing that for him, our relationship always had a strict boundary, but knowing that Rita, my childhood friend, was the one who handed my story over to him. Her betrayal stung as much as losing everything else. I tried to understand her reasons, asking myself over and over why she had done it, but I found no answers. The days in my parents' apartment dragged on. Trapped between guilt and uncertainty, my mind revisited every conversation with Rita, every guarded expression, every calculated word. Gradually, it all made sense. She knew. From the start, she understood the weight of that contract, the impact it would have on my life. But why? That question haunted me relentlessly. It was on one of those colorless days, while walking through the neighborhood where I grew up, that my eyes landed on something I'd never noticed before. A small, discreet shop with a worn-out facade and a sign that read "Spiritual Help." Normally I would have walked right past, but something made me pause. An inexplicable sensation, as if an invisible force were guiding me inside. The moment I stepped in, a strong smell of incense filled the air. The place was crowded with lit candles, statuettes, and old books. Behind the counter stood a woman whose face could have belonged to someone in her 40s or 60s. She observed me with a penetrating gaze. Before I could say anything, she spoke. "You came seeking something no one else can give you, right?" Her voice went right through me. I felt exposed, like she already knew everything before I even opened my mouth. Still, I told her my story. I spoke about Bruno, about Rita, how everything had fallen apart and I'd lost everything. She listened without interrupting, only nodding occasionally. When I finished, her response came with unexpected weight. "There are ways to restore balance, but everything has a price." That was when she revealed the existence of a ritual. Something old, meant to bring justice to someone who'd been betrayed. The instructions were clear. I needed something personal of Rita's, an object infused with her energy. Besides that, black candles, a small mirror, and other items that were easy to find. The idea unsettled me, but at the same time, it felt like the only way to regain some control over my life. I went home with the instructions jotted down, my fingers gripping the paper as though it contained my salvation. I hesitated. Should I really go through with it? Part of me was still resisting. But there was another part, hurt, broken, consumed by anger, that screamed this was the right thing. Rita had destroyed my life. Now, it was her turn to feel the weight of the consequences. In the following days, I gathered everything necessary. A handkerchief Rita had once left at my house became the key piece. Every time I thought about what I was about to do, a mix of fear and determination coursed through me. This ritual wasn't a game, but faced with pain and betrayal, it seemed like the only answer that made sense. I told her everything that had been happening, how Rita seemed to be getting back what she had done, yet I still couldn't find relief. The woman merely nodded, as if she had foreseen my every word. When you seek retribution through such means, the weight of the scales doesn't just fall on the one who hurt you, but on you as well. The universe doesn't distinguish who's right or wrong. It only acts. Her words struck me like a blow. I'd never stopped to think about that. Driven by fury and pain, I performed the ritual without considering what might follow. When I left the shop, I felt something heavy inside me, as though I had taken on a burden I couldn't put down. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes around me. At first, they were minor things, moments of forgetfulness, strange dreams, and the unsettling sense of being watched. But over time, it got worse. My parents, always loving, began acting coldly, as if something invisible were driving a wedge between us. The few friends I had left drifted away one by one, until I found myself completely alone. One night, as I tried to sleep, a loud crash at my bedroom window startled me. I rushed to look, but there was nothing there. These incidents became routine, unexplained noises, shadows flitting at the edge of my vision, and a suffocating presence I could never see. It was on one of these nights that I finally understood what the woman at the shop meant. The ritual hadn't just affected Rita, it had left its mark on me. Something dark had taken root in my life, feeding on my guilt and fear. Desperate for answers, I went back to the shop. But when I got there, I found only an empty space. Nearby shopkeepers said they'd never seen such a place or the woman who ran it. As the days dragged on, my life crumbled further. My body grew weak, my sleep was plagued by nightmares, and exhaustion weighed on me constantly. It was as though something was draining my energy bit by bit, just as it was happening to Rita. That was when I started questioning everything. Was it worth it? Yes, she had broken my trust, but did that justify what I did? In the end, I simply paid her back in the same coin, and now I was paying a price far greater than I'd ever imagined. One anguished night, I grabbed the mirror I'd used in the ritual and hurled it against the wall, watching it shatter into 1,000 pieces. But instead of relief, a wave of tension filled the room. The air around me felt heavier, as if something invisible had stirred. A shiver ran down my spine, and I knew that whatever had been called forth would not leave so easily. That night, my parents' bedroom felt stifling. The silence was too heavy. Every sound echoed like thunder. I felt the presence there. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was watching me. I hugged my knees, huddled on the bed, trying to control the fear growing inside me. And for the first time, I realized there might be no way out. The following days turned into pure torment. The nightly noises persisted, and now they echoed during the day too. Shadows slid across walls, objects shifted places with no explanation, and the sensation of being accompanied by something invisible never left me. I didn't know how to bring it up with my parents. Ever since I'd returned, they'd grown distant, and any attempt to talk about what was happening only pushed them further away. One afternoon, while walking through the neighborhood, I spotted Rita again. She was standing outside her house, and her appearance unsettled me. Pale skin, sunken eyes, and hair, once perfectly styled, now disheveled. She was speaking to someone, but her voice was barely audible. The shock of seeing her in that state left me with conflicting emotions. Part of me believed it was fair, that she was paying for what she had done to me. But another part felt a growing weight in my chest, a question I couldn't push away. How far would this go? I went back home feeling more alone than ever. There was no one to share this with, no one who could understand what I was living through. My days turned into an endless cycle of fear, regret, and solitude. My parents' situation started deteriorating too. My mother began suffering from constant headaches, while my father, a man once full of energy, now seemed drained and absent. I couldn't ignore the feeling that it was all connected, that what I had awakened wasn't just targeting me, but was also affecting everyone around me. One night, in sheer desperation, I decided to seek help. I remembered Donna Joelma, a healer from my village who, during my childhood, was known for her prayers and cleansing rituals. I hadn't heard her name in years, but I decided to try. I asked neighbors and acquaintances until someone finally told me where to find her. She lived in a simple little house at the end of a cobblestone street, surrounded by trees and medicinal herbs. When I arrived, I was greeted by a serene yet penetrating gaze. Donna Joelma was an elderly lady with white hair and hands marked by time. I sat down in front of her and told her everything, from my history with Bruno to the ritual I had performed. She listened patiently, nodding now and then, but never looking surprised. When I finished, she looked at me firmly and said, "What you did cannot be easily undone. You opened a door, and closing it will take far more than a simple prayer." She explained that what I had invoked wasn't just a desire for justice, but a force now intertwined with me. According to her, this energy fed on heavy emotions, hatred, guilt, remorse. As long as I kept fueling those feelings, it would stay strong. To free myself, I'd have to face not only what I did to Rita, but also what I carried inside me. Donna Joelma agreed to help me, but warned that the process would be long and difficult. She prepared a cleansing with herbs, candles, and ancient prayers. During the ritual, a strange heat swept through my body, as if something were being torn away. When it was over, she gave me clear instructions. I had to seek out Rita, ask for forgiveness, and acknowledge my wrongdoing. Only then could I finally cut myself off from what I had summoned. The mere thought of facing Rita made my stomach churn. How could I find the words to ask forgiveness after what I'd done? But there was no running away. If I wanted my life back, I had to face it. I spent days gathering my courage. The fear wasn't just about her reaction, it was also about the weight of admitting how serious my mistake had been. Every time that memory came back, shame and guilt mixed together inside me. I kept hearing Donna Joelma's words in my mind. To close this cycle, you need to confront your own actions. I couldn't delay any longer. On an ordinary afternoon, I took a deep breath and walked to Rita's house. My heart hammered in my chest, as if it might break through my ribs. When I arrived, I saw the exterior was in rough shape, worn by time and neglect, mirroring what I imagined her state to be. With sweaty palms, I knocked on the door. A few moments later, Rita appeared. She looked even worse than I remembered. Her face was colorless, her eyes hollow and sunken, her hair messy. She recognized me immediately but stood still, uncertain about how to react. I summoned all the strength I had left and murmured, "I need to talk to you, Rita." She stared at me for a moment and with a heavy sigh stepped aside to let me in. The living room was nearly empty, cold, lifeless, just like her expression. I sat down and began to speak. I explained how betrayed I had felt, how her confession to Bruno had turned my life upside down. Then, with my eyes burning, I told her what I had done. The ritual, my thirst for revenge, and how I hadn't considered the consequences. Each sentence felt like it ripped through my throat, but it had to be done. She remained impassive. Her face gave away nothing, as though she couldn't process what she was hearing. But then, slowly, she lifted her eyes to mine and said something I never expected. "I got hurt too, Mila. I always thought of you as my sister, but when you drifted away, I felt replaced, cast aside. I wanted to hurt you because it hurt to lose you." Her words hit me like a punch. I had never considered that my absence hurt her, that my involvement with Bruno and my isolated life had left scars on our friendship. At that moment, it all made sense. We had both acted out of pain and a lack of understanding. The betrayal wasn't one-sided. I had hurt her too, in a different way. I apologized, not just for the ritual, but for every choice that had pushed her away. Rita listened in silence. After a long while, she nodded and said she accepted my apology, but she made it clear that rebuilding something that had been broken would take time. She was willing to try, but it wouldn't go back to what it once was overnight. I returned to my parents' place with a feeling that was hard to define. It wasn't exactly relief, but something inside me felt released, like a chain had been broken. Donna Joelma was right. Facing Rita and owning up to my mistakes had closed part of that door, but there was still more to be resolved. In the weeks that followed, I kept going to see Donna Joelma. More prayers, more cleansing rituals. Little by little, the weight lifted. The shadows and noises that haunted me disappeared. My relationship with my parents still bore marks, but the darkness that once hovered over us seemed to have faded. Something around me began to change. Over time, Rita and I started talking again on several occasions, although the old friendship never fully returned. In place of what we once had, a new bond emerged, grounded in honesty and an understanding of the mistakes we'd both made. She started rebuilding her life cautiously, and I, for my part, had to start over from rock bottom. I can't say my life went back to what it was before. That would be an illusion. What happened left deep scars, impossible to erase. I realized that revenge is never the right path, and that seeking justice through dark means always demands a far higher price than we can foresee. Even today, as I walk through the neighborhood, I sense traces of that past, as though a fragment of that energy still clings to me. But at least now I can move forward without losing myself to it. I learned not to let hatred or resentment guide me, because I know these feelings only push us into places from which it's hard to return. If there's anything I want people to take away from my story, it's that revenge is a mirror that reflects more than we'd like to see. I thought I was punishing Rita, but in the end, I punished myself. Crossing certain lines can change your fate forever, and some scars, no matter how much time passes, never fully disappear. These days, there are no shadows in my room, but there are still nights when I feel that invisible weight, as if something or someone never really went away. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to stay updated on all future narrations. I post new videos here every day. I hope to see you in the next one. On the screen now, I'm leaving 2 other great videos I know you'll enjoy. See you there.